Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Midnight Stories. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I thought it would be nice if everyone could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Alright, let's get comfy, relax, and begin. It was a night my grandmother never stopped talking about. Even in her last days, long after the war had ended, when London had rebuilt itself and life had carried on, she would tell the story, her eyes wide, voice tinged with a strange urgency, as if the weight of what had happened all those years ago still sat on her chest. I would sit there listening, but as I grew older, I realized I was hearing something far more than a wartime story. It was a warning, a reminder of how fragile life really is, and how sometimes you just have to trust your instincts. My dad, who was still just a baby then, had been one of the lucky ones. But my grandmother, she was a different case. She had lived through the bombs, the chaos, the constant fear of living in London during World War II. The air was thick with the sound of sirens, the night sky often lit by the hellish glow of explosions, and the streets echoed with the hurried footsteps of people trying to find safety before it was too late. She had lived in a small row house, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood, where the sounds of war were muffled by the thick walls. But that didn't mean she was safe. No one was safe in London at that time. It was in 1941, I believe, when the bombing raids had reached their peak. There was no rhyme or reason to where they hit, and the city became a patchwork of destruction and despair. That night was no different. The sirens had blared their warnings, and my grandmother had grabbed my dad, still just a baby, in her arms, and ran to her friend's house. Her own home had already been bombed out, reduced to rubble like so many others, and she had no choice but to seek shelter elsewhere. It was a simple enough arrangement. Her friend had a large house, an old house with a spare room on the top floor. It was a place to sleep, a place to wait out the bombing, a place to be safe for a time. The stairs creaked beneath her feet as she climbed up to the top floor, holding her baby in one arm while gripping the banister with the other. The air in the house was thick with tension, the kind you only feel when danger is looming close by. Every day, every night, the feeling of uncertainty hung in the air like an unwelcome guest that never left. The walls, old and sagging, seemed to groan under the weight of the stress, as if they, too, were anxious about what would come next. My grandmother never described her friend as anything other than kind, but there was something in the way she spoke about the house that made me think even she was unsettled. The house had a heavy atmosphere, a weight to it, like a place where things had happened, things you don't talk about. She walked down the hall, the floorboards beneath her feet creaking in protest. As she reached the top of the stairs, she noticed something strange. The air seemed colder here, despite the warmth of the fire burning downstairs. The flickering light from the staircase lantern cast long shadows against the walls, and for a brief moment, she felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. It was a feeling she couldn't shake, a sense that something wasn't right. But she wasn't the kind of person to let fear control her. She was strong, practical. She didn't let the constant fear of bombing raids overwhelm her. But this was different. This felt different. As she made her way up the stairs with my dad cradled in her arms, that's when it happened. It wasn't a voice, at least not a voice like any other voice. It was as if the air itself had taken on form and spoke to her, cold, sharp, and direct. "Don't sleep in that room tonight," it said. She froze, gripping the banister tightly. Her heart raced. Her mind scrambled to make sense of what she had just heard. There was no one there, no one that she could see, but the air seemed alive, charged with something she couldn't understand. She didn't argue. She didn't question it. She turned around slowly and began walking back down the stairs, her feet moving without thinking, as though her body had already made the decision for her. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, her friend looked up at her, confused. My grandmother didn't even hesitate. She didn't try to explain what had happened, just told her friend that she and my dad would be sleeping in the sitting room instead. Her friend, who was already worn out from the constant stress of the war, didn't argue. She was a good woman, But like many people at the time, she was tired, too tired to argue over something that didn't make sense. She huffed and agreed, though with some irritation. The room was cold and drafty, not ideal for sleeping, but it was a small price to pay for safety, or so my grandmother thought. That night, they settled into the sitting room, where the fire crackled softly in the hearth. My grandmother laid my dad down on a blanket, her mind still troubled by the strange feeling she couldn't shake. But she pushed it aside, thinking it was just the tension of the war getting to her, the constant sense of unease. The house settled into quiet, the kind of quiet that happens before a storm. The winds howled outside, rattling the windows, and the distant sound of sirens could still be heard in the distance, a constant reminder that danger was never far. But within the walls of that room, they were safe, at least for now. The hours dragged on, and my grandmother eventually fell asleep in a chair beside my dad's cot. She was exhausted, but the strange feeling still lingered, gnawing at her from the back of her mind. It wasn't until the bomb hit that she finally understood why she had listened to that voice. In the dead of night, the world around her erupted. The house shook violently, as if it were a mere toy in the hands of some malevolent force. The floor beneath her feet felt like it was going to give way, and she was thrown from her chair. The explosion was deafening, so loud that it felt as if the very earth itself had split open. The walls groaned and cracked, the ceiling caving in as if the weight of the world had suddenly come crashing down. She scrambled to her feet, heart pounding, mind racing with panic. And that's when she saw it. The roof of the house, the very room where she had been moments ago, was gone. The rubble, the debris, it all came crashing down right onto the cot where my dad had been sleeping. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. My grandmother didn't know how she had managed to reach my dad's cot, but she did. She had to. She was shaking, terrified, but there he was, still asleep, oblivious to the destruction all around him. The house had been partially destroyed, the roof caved in by the force of the explosion. The walls were cracked, the windows shattered, and dust filled the air, choking the life out of everything it touched. The smoke hung heavy, but through it all, my grandmother's only thought was my dad. She held him close, not understanding how they had both survived. It took hours for the smoke to clear, for the chaos to die down. The bomb had come from far away, but it had hit so close, so dangerously close. My grandmother's friend, too, had survived the blast, though she was injured. But the house, her home, was gone, and my dad's cot, where he should have been sleeping, was now a pile of rubble, crushed under the weight of the roof. My grandmother never questioned the voice that had told her to stay out of that room. She didn't need to. She knew, deep in her heart, that whatever it was, whether it was instinct, fate, or something else entirely, it had saved her and my dad's lives. She had listened. She had trusted her gut, and it had kept them both safe when everything else around them had fallen apart. She lived the rest of her life with that story, a story she swore by, never wavering in her belief that whatever had warned her that night had done so for a reason. She never forgot the weight of that moment, how close they had come to losing everything. In the end, I don't think she ever fully understood what happened, but she didn't need to. The most important thing was that she had trusted her instincts, had listened to that voice, and had made the decision to change her course when it mattered most. She had saved my dad's life, and for that, she would never forget. I had just gotten my CPR certification a week ago, and I honestly never thought I'd actually have to use it so soon. I was at a thrift store with a couple of friends, browsing for Halloween costumes. It was one of those quiet afternoons when nothing much was going on, just the soft hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and the occasional rustle of hangers being shifted. We were laughing and joking around, having fun as we looked through the racks. I remember holding up a ridiculous pirate hat, joking about how it'd be perfect for a costume. Everything was normal until the door opened. Someone came in and walked straight up to the counter. I didn't pay much attention at first. Then the store got dead silent. Everyone stopped talking, and it was like time slowed down. I don't know why, but I felt like something was wrong. I wasn't sure if it was the way the person looked or just the heavy silence. but it fell off. A second later, one of my friends, who had been browsing by the costumes, came running up to me with a worried look on his face. "Dude, someone's passed out in the parking lot. We need help. Like now." Without even thinking, I said, "I'm CPR certified. I'll go check it out. You need to call 911. I don't know why I said it so quickly. Maybe it was adrenaline, or maybe it was just that deep down, I knew something serious was happening. Either way, I turned and walked toward the door. I could feel the tension in the air as I stepped outside. It was strange. Everything around me felt normal, but the vibe was just wrong. People were milling around, not really doing anything. The bright sunlight was sharp against my eyes. There was a car in the distance, parked far out by itself. I squinted and started walking toward it, but no one had said anything about the car yet. I looked around. "Where?" I called out. Someone from the group shouted, "It's in the car. Over there." They pointed toward the solitary vehicle. I started running, my heart already hammering. As I got closer, the weight of the situation started to hit me. I felt a sickening feeling crawl up my spine. This wasn't some ordinary medical emergency. Something was wrong, really wrong. The way people were reacting, or maybe not reacting, made me realize that this was no accident. This was a drug overdose. I could feel my stomach tighten in a way that wasn't from running. When I reached the car, I froze. She was slumped against the driver's side window. She looked like she was sleeping, but she wasn't. Her face was completely blue, the kind of blue you get when you're not getting enough oxygen. The blood was draining from her face, and her skin had this eerie, grayish tint. It wasn't just her face, her whole body looked wrong. It felt wrong. I swallowed hard and opened the door. As soon as I did, the overwhelming smell of stale air and chemicals hit me. It was like something had been trapped inside the car for hours. Her head lolled to the side, and I saw it. Her eyes. They were open, but they were glazed over. It wasn't just that they were open, it was like they were staring through me, not at me. My pulse raced, and for a split second, I thought I was too late. She was dead. I had to push past the panic. I wasn't going to give up on her, not without trying. I leaned in, checking her pulse, and my heart dropped. Nothing, not even a faint beat. She was gone. Then, as I turned her head, I saw it. Tears running down her face. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, or maybe sweat, but no, it was tears. There was a tiny stream of liquid trailing down her cheek, pooling at her jawline. I had never seen anything like it. I couldn't help it, I froze. It was like my body couldn't move, couldn't react. I just stared at her, confused and maybe a little scared. I mean, how could this happen? How could someone just be sitting here, their life slipping away, while everyone else just stood by? I snapped out of it when someone else came running over. A woman, her face pale and frantic, opened the passenger side door and started calling to her. But the woman didn't respond. That's when I snapped into action. "She's not breathing," I said, the words coming out of me without even thinking. My CPR training kicked in, and I was already pulling her out of the car. It wasn't easy. Her body felt too heavy for someone so small. We dragged her to the parking lot, and as gently as I could, I laid her on the ground. I had to focus. I had to think. I checked for a pulse again, and when I didn't find one, my hands were already on her chest, pushing down hard. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears as I counted in my head. 1-2-3-4-5-6. It was like I was in some kind of trance, not really aware of what was going on around me, but completely aware that this woman's life was in my hands. Seconds stretched into what felt like hours. I was barely able to focus, the weight of what I was doing pressing on me. Was this enough? Was I doing it right? What if it was too late? The sound of sirens pierced through my thoughts, and I saw the ambulance pull in, skidding to a stop. 2 EMTs jumped out, and I stepped back to give them space. They quickly took over, strapping her onto a stretcher and starting to pump air into her lungs, their movements swift and practiced. The next few moments felt like a blur. I stood there, my hands shaking, watching as the paramedics worked. I wanted to help, but there was nothing more I could do now. The officers had arrived, and I could hear them talking to the EMTs, explaining what had happened. "We gave her Narcan," one of the paramedics said, "but it's too late. She's been down too long. It's just a waiting game now." They continued CPR on her, but it was clear that it was over. A second ambulance arrived, and more paramedics climbed out. It was like they were surrounding her, trying to work some miracle that no one believed in anymore. I stood back, trying to process everything. My brain couldn't keep up with what was happening. I wasn't sure if it was the sight of her blue skin or the fact that I had just been doing chest compressions on someone who was almost definitely dead, but it all felt unreal. It felt like I wasn't really standing there, like this wasn't really happening, but was. As the ambulance doors slammed shut, I heard one of the officers talking to a colleague, his voice low. She's got kids, toys, and a car seat in the back. She was young too, just too far gone. I couldn't stop myself from glancing at the car. It wasn't just the woman, it was everything else. The empty pill bottles scattered on the floor of the car, the needles, the desperation that clung to everything. This wasn't just a tragic overdose. This was someone who had been living in the depths of addiction, someone who had never had a chance to escape it. And now her kids, if they were still around, would have to grow up without her. The police officer said something about contacting her family, but I couldn't really hear him. My mind was still stuck on the scene. Her face, blue and lifeless, her tears still wet on her cheek. I tried to shake it off, but it stayed with me. I couldn't forget it. When I finally turned to walk back into the store, my friends were standing near the door, looking at me with concern. They didn't ask what happened. They didn't need to. They saw it in my eyes. I didn't need to talk about it. I never found out what happened to her. I never knew if she made it or if she died on the way to the hospital. But it didn't matter. What mattered was the fact that, for a brief moment, I had seen a life hanging by a thread. And I had tried. I tried my best to save her, even if it wasn't enough. As I drove home later that day, the weight of it all hit me. That feeling, the one that stays with you when you can't unsee something, it wrapped around me like a heavy blanket. I didn't know if I would ever truly be okay again after what I saw. But all I could do was keep moving forward. Because that's what life does. It keeps moving no matter what. And I would too. It was just like any other morning, or so I thought. The streets were dark, wrapped in mist, and the world felt thick with the haze of early hours. It was around 5 a.m., a time it seemed to straddle the edge of night and day, when the city was still half asleep. My feet crunched along the damp pavement as I made my way to the bus stop, munching absent-mindedly on a banana. I was tired, exhausted even. I hadn't slept well, the kind of restless sleep that only leaves you more drained than before. My mind drifted between thoughts as I walked, debating something as trivial as whether I wanted to get Starbucks before or after the bus ride. It was nothing important, just a vague and random decision to make the morning pass a little faster. The air had that peculiar chill to it, the one that clings to your skin and makes you tug your jacket tighter around your shoulders. The streetlights flickered in the fog, casting long, strange shadows that twisted and morphed as I walked past. I was almost at the corner of my street when I noticed him. I barely registered him at first, too tired, too out of it, and really just too disoriented by the early hour to pay any mind to anything other than getting to the bus. But as I neared the dimly lit intersection, something caught my attention. A man stepped out from the alley to my left. He was tall, his face hidden behind a black mask, his silhouette nearly blending with the shadows of the fog. At first, my brain didn't fully process it. I thought maybe he was just another early riser, someone walking to work or someone on a jog. But then he shouted, "Put down your fucking purse." The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. I didn't move at first. My brain was still stuck in that foggy, sleepy state, trying to figure out if I was hearing things or if this was some kind of strange dream. The voice was harsh, grating, but it was too real. He was pointing something at me, something black, something that gleamed even in the faint light of the street lamp. It didn't take long for my exhausted mind to click into reality. A gun. He was holding a gun. Time slowed for a moment. I felt a tightness in my chest, like my heart was trying to beat its way out of my ribcage. The banana in my hand felt absurd. I looked at it, looked at the gun, then back at the man's masked face. My legs felt like they were frozen in place, too weak to move, my brain screaming at me to do something. anything, but nothing came out. I didn't even know if I could run. "Put down your bags," he repeated, his voice now cold, more insistent. I could hear the tremor in his words, a kind of anger that made me take a breath, calm myself down just enough to respond. Okay, I'm putting them down," I muttered, not even fully registering the fact that I was speaking aloud. My hands, still sticky from the banana, fumbled with my bag. My body was doing something automatic, like some sort of muscle memory, trying to act in a way that would calm the situation. I knew what was happening, knew the right moves to make. Slowly lower my bag, show that I wasn't a threat. I placed the bag on the sidewalk, then heard him bark, "Walk over here. Get down on the fucking ground." The command was simple enough, yet everything inside me rebelled. My feet didn't want to move. I didn't want to walk toward the alley, toward the darkness. It was too close, too real, too terrifying. But I was terrified of what would happen if I didn't. Slowly, I started walking in his direction, every step feeling like it was pulling me toward something worse. Okay, I said, my voice trembling barely above a whisper. I don't even know why I kept talking, maybe to keep him from getting more aggressive, maybe to distract myself from the rising panic. As I took the first steps toward him, my stomach twisted into knots. My heart was pounding in my ears, but I kept walking, my feet dragging, my mind a blur. He kept the gun aimed at me the entire time, and every movement of his was so deliberate, so calculated. It was like he had done this 1,000 times. Down on the ground, he ordered, and I obeyed without thinking, without even knowing what I was doing. My body collapsed to the ground, my knees hitting the wet pavement hard. I could smell the dampness of the air, the faint scent of gasoline from the nearby cars. I didn't want to look up, didn't want to see his face again. But when I did, I saw something change in him. He was staring at me, studying me. For a split second, I felt his eyes on me, as if he was trying to figure something out. Then it clicked. It was like I could feel his realization before it hit him. I wasn't a man. I was a woman. There was no way for me to explain how I knew it, but in that moment, I knew. It was something in the way he looked at me. His whole posture shifted, something subtle but noticeable. He stood up abruptly, his grip on the gun tightening. I could hear the rush of adrenaline in my veins, and for a moment, I didn't know whether to breathe a sigh of relief or be terrified of what came next. "Come with me," he ordered, pointing toward the dark alley. My stomach flipped. The alley was a dead end. There was nowhere to run, no one to hear me scream. The thought of being dragged down there, into that hole in the city, was almost more than I could bear. And then I remembered the stories, the ones I'd heard about, a series of assaults that had taken place in the neighborhood. These weren't isolated incidents, and the thought that he could do whatever he wanted with no one around to stop him made me want to break down and cry. But I couldn't. Not now. Not when I was still fighting to stay alive. I told myself I wouldn't go down there. I couldn't. It was either fight or it was nothing. There was a voice in my head, a voice that kept yelling at me, urging me to run, but it was drowned out by the cold reality of the gun pressed against my skull. Another voice whispered, telling me to just follow him, to keep him calm, to obey, and maybe he'd let me go. But that wasn't going to work. Not with him. "Come on, I'm coming," I said, trying to make my voice sound calm, trying to hide the panic that was creeping up. He was watching me closely, eyes narrowing. He was buying it. I took one step backward, then another. My heart was hammering in my chest, and the wet pavement felt like it was sucking my shoes in. He turned his body, shifting slightly toward the alley, and that's when I saw my chance. I wasn't thinking. My body acted before I could process it, before I could second-guess myself. I sprinted. I don't even know how. It was like my body just knew what needed to happen. I ran without thinking, my legs pumping furiously, my breath ragged. I could hear him behind me, shouting something, but I didn't dare turn around. All I could focus on was the sound of my feet slapping against the wet pavement, the thudding of my heart in my chest. I screamed. I didn't mean to. It just happened. The high-pitched wail was almost unrecognizable, like it came from someone else. But it was me. I was screaming, and I couldn't stop. I ran for what felt like miles, my breath tearing at my lungs, but I didn't stop. Not once. Not even when I reached the end of the block. I turned corner after corner, lost in the adrenaline rush, my mind swirling. I don't even remember thinking about where I was going. I just kept moving. Eventually, I made it back to my apartment, but I didn't feel safe. Not yet. Not until I was inside, the door locked, the world on the other side of that threshold. The adrenaline was still coursing through me, keeping my legs shaking and my mind buzzing. The police came an hour later, after I'd finally been able to stop shaking. They went to the alley, but by then, the man was gone. They couldn't find any trace of him, not even a footprint. All that was left was the banana peel I dropped in my panic, browning in the dim light of the alleyway. For days afterward, I couldn't shake the feeling. My mind kept playing the what-ifs. What if I hadn't gotten away? What if I hadn't been able to talk, hadn't been able to move? What would have happened if I'd gone down that alley? I'm lucky. I know I'm lucky. That night, I wasn't hurt. But even now, when I think back on it, the fear still lingers, even if I can't quite touch it. I'll never forget the sound of my own scream, the cold bite of the gun barrel, or the feeling of running for my life through the foggy morning. I think about the fact that it could have been worse, that I could have been someone else's story, and I'm thankful every day that I'm not. It was one of those days when everything felt like it was going fine until it didn't. I was delivering a hot tub to a fancy, gated community near Branson, Missouri. The kind of place with big houses perched on hills, manicured lawns, and construction workers scattered about. The place was under construction, and from the looks of it, the mansion was still being put together, but the owner, a realtor or contractor, was anxious to get the hot tub on his fourth-floor balcony. I arrived early, the sun barely up, and parked my truck by the driveway. The construction crew was busy, running around doing their thing, barely noticing me at first. A couple of them approached when they saw me unloading the hot tub, and they quickly briefed me on where it needed to go. The hot tub was to be set on the fourth-floor balcony, but there was a catch. The layout of the house was weird. The fourth floor wasn't technically a fourth floor in the traditional sense. It was more like the ground floor because of the way the house was built on a hillside. The other 3 floors sat on the slope, and the driveway aligned with the fourth floor entrance. It made for a weird design and an even weirder delivery. The plan was simple in theory. I would bring the hot tub from the driveway, down the yard, up a ramp to the porch, through the living room, and out the back patio doors onto the deck. The catch was that the deck was still under construction. Most of it was unfinished, with huge sections missing. All they had put in place was just enough decking to allow me to get the hot tub across and set it down in the far corner, where it would stay. But there was no railing. The hot tub weighed around 900 pounds, and the drop off that deck was 4 stories. If I fell, I wasn't coming back up. I took a deep breath as I wheeled the tub out of the truck, and the workers gathered around to help. They weren't professionals in hot tub deliveries, but they seemed eager enough, and I wasn't going to argue. We got the tub down into the yard, onto the ramp, through the living room, and finally out the back door onto the deck. As we maneuvered it across the unfinished section, I felt the nerves creeping in. One wrong move, and this whole thing could go south in a split second. We made it to the far corner where the tub was meant to sit, and I told them to stop. I had done this 1,000 times, but every time, the weight of that hot tub seemed to get heavier. Lifting it up and setting it down wasn't the hard part. That was a controlled, calculated motion. The real issue came when we were about to get the dolly free from under the tub. Normally, I'd tilt the tub onto its side, pop the straps off the dolly, and get everything settled. But with the deck being so narrow and unfinished, there was no way to do it safely. I explained the process to the workers. We need to block one side of the dolly, tilt the hot tub, and then free the straps from underneath it. After that, we'll tilt it back, remove the blocks, and set it down. Simple, but we need to be careful. The workers seemed to understand. We worked together to set the blocks under one side of the dolly, and I tilted the tub. But that was when things started to go wrong. I found myself standing dangerously close to the edge of the deck. My feet were 4 inches away from nothing but open air, 4 stories up. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. If I moved wrong, if I lost my footing even for a second, I was going over the edge. There was nothing between me and those boulders down below. "Everyone freeze," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my body. Everyone just stays still. The workers stopped, their faces tense as they held the hot tub steady. I could see the fear in their eyes, too. We had to get the dolly free from one side, but not the other. The tub had to lean further toward me, and I wasn't sure I could keep my balance. I shifted my feet, trying to gain a better grip, but I had no room to move. My heels were already hanging off the edge of the deck. The drop beneath me seemed to stretch out, and I could feel the wind picking up, making everything feel even more unstable. I'm not in a good spot, I muttered, barely loud enough for them to hear me. I could feel my heart in my throat as I leaned further into the tub, trying to keep it from tipping over. The weight of it felt unbearable, pressing down on my body. I tried to shift my weight to get a better angle, but that's when it happened. One of the construction workers, eager to get the dolly free, kicked the corner of the hot tub. It was a desperate move, and it worked. The dolly finally loosened, but I hadn't been ready. My feet were too far from the edge, and before I could react, I felt myself slipping. Shit, I'm falling, I yelled. The workers scrambled, trying to reach me, but it was too late. My feet shot out from under me, and I felt my body lean back. My arms flailed wildly as I tried to grab onto anything to stop myself from falling. I could see the boulders below, growing larger and larger in my peripheral vision. My body was in free fall, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. But then, something strange happened. I felt a sudden, sharp tug at the small of my back, like a rope had yanked me. I didn't know what was happening, but I was being pulled back, away from the edge. My stomach lurched as my body lurched forward instead of down. It was the strangest sensation. 1 second, I was certain I was going over, and the next, I was slamming into the bottom of the tub. I looked around, trying to make sense of what had happened. The dolly had been removed, and the tub was now standing upright with me pressed against it. Then I saw it. One of the construction workers had managed to secure a strap to the house just before I fell. He must have been playing with it earlier, trying to make sure it was secure, and when I went over the edge, the strap had caught me and arrested my fall. The worker had pulled it tight, just in time, saving me from the drop that would have killed me. I could barely breathe, my chest tight with relief. My mind was racing. My body was still shaking from the shock, and I could barely stand, but I managed to get back on my feet. The worker who had saved me looked just as shaken, but his hands were still gripping the strap, holding it taut. He was the only reason I was alive right now. He didn't save me out of some grand gesture. It wasn't a heroic moment. He was just doing his job, trying to secure the tub, and in the process, he saved my life. I took a moment, gathering myself before turning to him. I didn't know what to say. What do you say to someone who just saved your life? The words felt small, but I had to say something. Thank you, I said, my voice rough. I don't know what would have happened without you. He just nodded, his face pale, clearly still processing what had just happened. There wasn't much more to say, but in that moment, I knew I had to do something for him, something to show my gratitude. I had planned a vacation for my family. It was a surprise, a trip to Breckenridge, Colorado for Christmas. But after what had happened, I knew I had to do something for him. I told my wife and daughter that the trip would be for someone else. I sent him and his family to Breckenridge instead. It was my vacation, the one I'd been saving up for, but I didn't care. He deserved it more than I did. The contractor had no idea how close we came to disaster, and I wasn't going to tell him. The workers finished up the rest of the job, and I left that job site with a sense of disbelief. I was still shaken, still processing everything, but at least I was alive. That day, I realized something. Sometimes, the people who save you aren't the ones you expect. They're not heroes in capes or in the movies. They're just regular people doing their jobs, and sometimes they save your life in the process. And for that, I was eternally grateful. Last summer, I was back at my parents' house for the holidays. It wasn't anything special, just one of those trips where you find yourself back in your childhood bedroom, reminiscing about old memories while trying to avoid thinking too hard about the passage of time. I was sitting at my desk, browsing the internet, just killing time. It was around 3 a.m., and everything outside was quiet, the kind of silence that only comes after the whole world has fallen asleep. The house was still, with only the faint hum of the fridge in the kitchen breaking the quiet. Then my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number at first, and I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me pick up. I had barely brought the phone to my ear when the call ended abruptly, just as I was about to say hello. I wasn't sure what to make of it, but as I stared at the screen, I noticed it was a call from my sister's number. That in itself was odd. My sister's room was just down the hall from mine. She was literally a few steps away, so why would she call me at 3 a.m.? It wasn't like her to do something like that unless there was a reason. I didn't think much of it first, but curiosity got the better of me. I stood up, deciding to go check on her. I was about halfway down the hall when I heard it, my sister screaming. The sound ripped through the house, and a chill ran down my spine. I bolted the rest of the way to her room and shoved the door open, almost afraid to see what might be inside. She was sitting up in bed, her face pale and tear-streaked. Her eyes were wide, locked on the dark corner of the room, like she was staring at something. Someone. What happened? I asked, my voice low and shaky. She just stared at me for a moment, too frightened to speak. Then, her trembling hands reached out, pointing at the empty corner of the room. I saw something, she whispered, her voice barely audible. It was right next to my face. A shadow. I couldn't see what it was, but it was so close. It was like it was watching me. And then, I screamed. I didn't know how to respond to that. There was nothing there. No shadow. No figure lurking in the corner. The room was just like it always was, dim, quiet, and empty except for her shaking form sitting on the bed. I sat down next to her, trying to calm her down. I wanted to tell her it was just a nightmare or that she was imagining things, but the look in her eyes, those wide, fearful eyes, told me it was something more. She wasn't just scared. She was terrified. Then something else hit me, something even stranger. I pulled my phone from my pocket to check the call log again. There it was, her name, the missed call from her number, exactly at 3 a.m. I showed it to her, and her face went even paler. I didn't call you, she said, her voice trembling even more. My phone isn't even in here. That made no sense. My sister was adamant she hadn't called me, but when I checked the log, I could see it, her number right there calling me. But she didn't have her phone in her room. It was downstairs, in her purse, on the counter where she always left it before bed. My heart started racing. I stood up, my head spinning as I tried to make sense of it. How could that be? How could I have a call log showing her number, yet she didn't have her phone? It was as if the call had come from somewhere else entirely. But that wasn't possible, was it? Let's check your phone, I suggested, hoping to get some kind of explanation. We both walked downstairs, the sound of our footsteps echoing in the quiet house. We reached the kitchen, and there, on the counter, was her purse. I unzipped it and pulled out her phone. Sure enough, there were no recent calls. No missed calls, no records of the one that had just shown up on my phone. It was as if that call had never happened on her end at all. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Something wasn't right. We both stood there in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation sinking in. My sister was still visibly shaken, looking at me with wide eyes like she was waiting for me to explain what had just happened. But I couldn't explain it. I didn't know what to say. The more I thought about it, the more it didn't make sense. And then, the thought hit me like a ton of bricks. Had I been hearing things? No, I had seen the call come through on my phone. There was no mistaking it. I had gotten a call, but my sister, her phone didn't even show it. How could that be? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe there was some technical glitch. Maybe some weird phone malfunction. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the answer. I had a sinking feeling that we were missing something. There was something more to all this, something I couldn't explain. We stayed in the kitchen for a while, both of us too rattled to sleep. The quiet of the house fell off. Too still, too quiet, as if the air itself was holding its breath. I kept thinking about the call, how it had come from my sister's number, yet she hadn't made it. I thought about her room, the way she'd screamed, the way she'd said she saw a shadow so close to her face. By the time the sun began to rise, I was exhausted, mentally drained, and still unable to make sense of anything. We decided to try and sleep, but it wasn't the kind of sleep you want to have after something like that. My sister ended up sleeping in my room that night, just to feel safe. Neither of us said much after that, but we both knew there was something strange happening. The next day, everything seemed normal, at least on the surface. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The idea that there was something or someone inside that house, something we couldn't see, kept gnawing at me. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, a coincidence, a trick of the mind. But deep down, I knew better. I never found a reasonable explanation for the call. There were no signs of anyone in the house, no evidence of anything unusual, except for that moment, when my sister screamed when the phone call happened, and when we couldn't make sense of any of it. And over time, it became clear that the strangest part of all was that we never talked about it again. Not in detail, anyway. We both knew something had happened, but we never revisited it. There was no need to really. The feeling it left behind was enough. And here's the kicker. The call from my sister's phone, the one that didn't show up on her end, stayed on my phone's call log for days after it happened. It wasn't until a week later that the call log finally deleted itself. But even now, when I think about that night, I can't explain it. It felt like something or someone had reached out to us. But who or what? That's the part one still can't figure out. Sometimes I wonder if my sister and I were just both tired, overthinking things. But then I remember her reaction, the way she was so scared, and I know it wasn't just in our heads. Something strange happened in that house that night, something that neither of us can explain. And as I've thought about it more, I've come to the realization that sometimes the scariest thing isn't what you see or hear. It's the things you can't explain. The things that don't make sense, the things that leave you with more questions than answers. And maybe, just maybe, there are things in this world that we aren't meant to understand. I don't know what happened that night, but I know one thing for sure. If something ever calls me from my sister's number again, I won't be picking up. It was supposed to be one of those nights. The kind where we stayed up late, watched movies, and gorged ourselves on snacks while our parents and grandparents went out for their adult dinner. It was the perfect setup, a group of cousins and siblings, about 10 of us, ranging from 8 to 16 years old, holed up in my aunt's house, having a great time, just being kids. We were spread out across the living room and the nearby dining area, sprawled out on the couch, the floor, and anywhere we could find. The TV was on, some movie that no one was really paying attention to, and the chatter was more about random jokes, silly things that happened at school, and whatnot. Everyone seemed to be in a good mood. The kind of night where the only worries were about the snacks running out. But then it happened. The first thing I remember was the shaking. It wasn't subtle. It was a sudden, violent jolt that sent everything in the room rattling. The furniture groaned, and the TV flickered. At first, we all froze, thinking maybe it was just a strong gust of wind outside. But then the second thing hit, an enormous flash of light, bright enough to make everything in the room seem pale. It wasn't like a lightning strike. It wasn't just a quick flash. It was blinding, as if something had exploded. For a split second, I couldn't see anything, and then the house groaned again, shaking even harder. I remember hearing a few of my cousins scream, and the noise that followed, it sounded like the whole house was about to collapse. The walls felt like they were bending. It was the kind of shock that rattled your bones like a bomb had gone off right outside. I swear I could still feel it deep in my chest, like my heart had skipped a beat. I don't know why, but I just froze for a second, trying to process what was happening. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, like something had changed, like the world had shifted in a way we couldn't understand. The moment the flash and shake subsided, a deep silence filled the house. The kind of silence that made the blood rush in your ears. The kind that made you realize just how alone we were. Before I could even think, everyone started moving. We scrambled to our feet, gathering in the hallway, trying to stay together, all of us instinctively wanting to be as far away from whatever had just happened as possible. We whispered over each other, our voices shaking. There were some older cousins who immediately debated what to do. Some of them wanted to call the police, but a few of the older ones, probably sensing the confusion, the weirdness of the whole situation, decided that calling our parents was the better option. So we called them, and in that moment, I could hear my heart pounding in my chest, faster and louder than ever before. It felt like the whole world had gone silent except for that sound. There were only a few minutes of waiting, but it felt like hours. Everyone was just standing there in the hallway, some of us still in shock, some of us trying to come up with an explanation. I didn't want to say it out loud, but it felt like something had happened that shouldn't have. Something unnatural. Finally, we got our parents on the phone. They didn't seem to understand. They just asked us if we were okay. And when we told them what had happened, they told us it was probably just a power surge or maybe something electrical. Probably a transformer, they suggested, try to calm us down. It didn't help. I don't think any of us were convinced. Not after what we felt and saw. It just didn't sit right. After that, we all started to feel a little braver. Maybe it was because we were kids, and kids didn't always know when to be scared. But at the same time, there was that lingering unease in the pit of my stomach. We didn't know what had happened, but we didn't want to stay huddled in the hallway either. So a few of us, the older cousins, decided to venture back into the living room, keeping our distance from the windows, the door, anything that could be a threat. We grabbed whatever we could find for protection. Nothing real, just random things like kitchen knives and broken pieces of a broomstick. They weren't much, but it felt like something. I don't know what we were expecting. Maybe we thought whatever caused the flash would come back, but none of us said it out loud. The air felt thick again, like something was waiting. The living room was almost exactly how we left it, except for one thing: the atmosphere. It felt wrong, like the space was holding its breath. We sat there, trying to act normal, but every time we heard a car outside or the wind pick up, we jumped. We stayed that way for what felt like forever, all of us glued to the couch or standing in the corners of the room, watching the windows, listening for anything. The only thing we heard was the faint hum of the fridge in the kitchen. An hour passed. 2 hours. The tension didn't ease. We talked quietly, but even then we kept our eyes on the windows, the door, every shadow. The more time passed, the more I wanted to believe it had all been some mistake, a trick of the mind or something, a weird electrical glitch. But deep down I knew it wasn't. Something had happened. It was real. When the front door opened, we all jumped. My aunt and uncle, along with our grandparents, walked in, laughing, clearly not understanding the kind of fear we just lived through. They were so casual about it, asking why we were all sitting around looking so tense. They laughed at us, saying it was probably just a thunderstorm or some car backfiring nearby. No one could believe that we'd been so rattled. To them, it was just another boring night of kids being kids. We tried to explain what had happened, but they didn't seem to get it. There were no signs of anything unusual outside. No scorch marks, no debris, nothing that would explain the flash, the shake, the feeling that something was wrong. None of our neighbors reported anything strange either. It was like it had never happened at all. Over the years, we've talked about it, still trying to piece together what went down that night. Some of us have tried to rationalize it, saying it was probably some kind of transformer explosion or an electrical malfunction that caused everything to light up and shake like that. But no one really knows. We've all come up with different theories. Some say it was a weird accident. Others say it was something more mysterious, but no one has been able to explain the sensation of that moment. The way the world seemed to shift, the way we all felt something we couldn't explain. It's been 10 years since that night, and we still talk about it when we get together. It's become one of those things we just can't forget. But no matter how much time passes, I still can't shake the feeling that whatever happened that night, whatever caused that explosion of light and sound, was something real, something that happened outside of our understanding. We might never know for sure what it was, but every time we bring it up, there's always that feeling, that lingering unease, and we all look at each other with the same unspoken thought. We know it wasn't just some random event. We felt it. We all felt it. And that, to me, is the scariest part. That feeling deep in your gut that something happened that can't be explained away. I was 17, and like most of my friends, I had just gotten my license. At the time, I was living in a small suburban town with few places to go, so my friends and I filled the gaps with the usual teenager stuff. Hanging out, going to the movies, and of course, finding something reckless to do to make life feel a little more exciting. One of the things we had made a habit of was exploring abandoned houses. There was something about those old places, half crumbling and forgotten, that drew us in. They were our little escape from the dullness of the world. Most of the houses we found were old, maybe once grand, but now just shells of their former selves. We'd sneak in, explore, and sometimes throw parties. The more decrepit the house, the better it seemed. The thrill of breaking in, of being somewhere we weren't supposed to be, was part of the allure. But this one house I found on my way home from work one night felt different from the rest. It was massive, a hulking skeleton of a house with high wooden beams and towering windows that had been boarded up years ago. There was something about the way the place sat, half constructed, as if it had been abandoned mid-build, that caught my attention every time I drove by. I could see the massive property stretching out behind it, the grass long and untamed. The house was a mystery. I had to show it to my friend Kyle. We've been talking about hitting up abandoned places for weeks, but none of them seemed to live up to what I had found. So, one summer evening, we made plans to go check it out. I had just gotten my car. Nothing too fancy, just a beat-up sedan, but it was mine, and it had become my ticket to freedom. That night, I picked Kyle up, and we decided to head to the movie after the house. Just make the trip feel more normal. The sun was starting to set, casting an orange hue across the sky. It was the perfect time to drive. As we neared the house, I slowed down and turned down a small dirt road that led to the long, overgrown driveway. The house loomed in front of us, barely visible beyond the trees. I didn't want to pull too far up to the house, so I stopped just at the edge of the driveway. For a second, the car's headlights lit up the empty windows, making the house look even more eerie. There was a feeling in the air, like the whole place was holding its breath, waiting for us to make a move. We both sat in the car for a moment, looking at the house and listening to the sound of crickets buzzing in the evening air. Weird, Kyle muttered, his voice low. He was a couple of years younger than me, but we'd been friends since middle school. I could tell he was already uneasy, probably from the same feeling I had. But I figured it was just our imagination running wild. Yeah, let's just take a quick look around and then head to the movie, I said. We weren't planning on doing anything reckless, just checking out the house for a few minutes. But as we sat there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't just the house itself, it was the whole area. There was a weird quietness to everything. We didn't stay long. Maybe 10 seconds after pulling in, I started to get the feeling that we shouldn't be there, like someone was watching. It wasn't a paranoia thing, more like an instinct, and I trusted it. Without saying anything, I put the car in reverse and began to back out. The engine rumbled as I turned the wheel, and we headed back toward the main road. Just as we got to the end of the driveway, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The headlights of a truck were right behind us, way too close. "Did you see that?" Kyle whispered, his voice tight. I nodded, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. It was a big truck, maybe a Ford or Chevy, some kind of diesel, and the headlights were blindingly bright, riding our tail like it was intentional. I couldn't help but feel a little jump in my stomach. It wasn't just the headlights. There was something about the way the truck moved, how it seemed to be following us without any regard for speed. I kept driving. We were only a few miles from town, so I figured I'd turn onto the main road and shake the truck off. At the stoplight, I made a right turn, hoping it would be enough. But as I did, the truck didn't slow down. Instead, it sped up, cutting through a gas station on the corner, and ended up blocking the road, effectively trapping us. My heart skipped a beat. "What the hell?" Kyle said under his breath. I could hear the fear in his voice now. My fingers went cold on the steering wheel. This wasn't normal. The truck's engine rumbled, its headlights blinding, and then the driver's side door opened. A huge guy, at least 6'5", stepped out. He was built like a tank, muscles bulging under his dark t-shirt. His arms were massive, and his hands looked like they could crush a skull. He moved toward us with a kind of deliberate slowness, like he was in no rush to get to us. I didn't even think, I just hit the power window button, rolling down the glass, my heart racing. The man stood there for a moment, silent, staring at us through the open window. The street was empty now. Just a few seconds ago, there had been cars at the gas station, people in line at the convenience store, but now, nothing. The place was deserted. "What were you doing back there?" His voice was deep, gravelly, and he spoke with a sort of cold calm that made me feel like I was in danger. I opened my mouth, but no words came out at first. My mind was racing, trying to figure out something to say. Then instinct kicked in. We were just making a U-turn. I blurted, the words coming out without thinking. The man's eyes didn't move, didn't blink. He stared at us, his gaze piercing through the window like he was trying to figure out whether I was lying. The silence stretched on forever. The air between us felt thick, charged with something dark. Finally, he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was wide, almost too wide, like he was enjoying something he wasn't telling us. He leaned in closer, his face just inches from mine, and I could smell the faint stench of sweat and cigarette smoke on him. "You kids better watch yourselves," he said, his tone almost friendly, but the words felt like a threat. "Next time, stay off other people's property." With that, he stepped back, turning toward his truck. The headlights flicked off, and for a moment, I thought he was going to say something else, but he didn't. He just climbed back into the truck, and before I could even react, he revved the engine and sped off down the road. I sat there, frozen, staring after him for what felt like forever. Carl didn't say a word. He was just sitting there, his hands clenched tight in his lap, eyes wide. I couldn't bring myself to move. My mind was still trying to process what had just happened. The whole situation felt unreal, like something out of a bad movie. Finally, I shook myself out of it. "Let's go," I said, my voice shaking. I put the car in drive and slowly pulled around the truck, heading down the road, keeping my eyes in the rearview mirror. I half expected to see his truck coming after us, but nothing. The road was empty. It was just us in the dark night. We didn't speak much after that. I drove Kyle to his house, and we barely said goodbye. When I got home, I locked the door behind me and just sat in my car, staring at the house. I couldn't shake the feeling that the man wasn't just some random guy looking to scare us off. There was something wrong about him, something off. And that house, I couldn't get out of my mind. I kept thinking about it, about how strange everything felt, like it wasn't abandoned at all. It's been years now, but I've never been back to that house. I don't know who that man was or what he was doing there, but I know one thing. That house, it's not just a construction site. There's something more to it, something dark. And the way the man looked at us, I'm convinced it's a cover for something worse. So yeah, I learned my lesson. Don't mess with abandoned houses. There's more going on behind those walls than you can see, more than you want to know. My house sits farther back in the lot than most of the others on the street. It's one of those older houses with an odd layout that doesn't really make sense. The sidewalk runs the length of the living room and ends at the front porch, which leads straight into the living room. The windows in there are huge, stretching almost from floor to ceiling, and they don't open, so there's no way to get any fresh air. It's great for natural light, though, flooding the room with sunshine during the day. But it also means there's no privacy. If someone's standing out front, they can see directly inside, and it feels like the whole world is watching. The house always felt exposed, even though the neighbors were far enough away. That evening, my family was out of town. They'd gone on a vacation for the week, leaving me to have the place to myself. I wasn't exactly thrilled to be alone, but I figured I'd make the most of it. I had plans to relax, maybe watch a few movies, and enjoy the freedom of not having to worry about anyone bothering me. But as the night went on, I got a little more adventurous. I didn't have to answer to anyone, so I cracked open a bottle of whiskey. I wasn't an alcoholic, but sometimes when I had the place to myself, I'd drink more than usual. By the time it hit 9 o'clock, I was tipsy, the kind of tipsy where everything feels a little bit softer, a little more colorful. The living room was dark, except for the pale light from the street lamps outside, filtering through those big windows. It was a peaceful kind of darkness. I could hear the wind rustling the leaves outside and the occasional car passing down the street. My phone was on the coffee table, buzzing with texts I couldn't be bothered to reply to. I lay down on the couch, the warmth of the alcohol still coursing through my veins, and before I knew it, I passed out. The next thing I remember was waking up suddenly. My eyes snapped open, and I felt this deep, overwhelming chill. It wasn't like the room was cold, not at all. It wasn't the temperature. It was more like an icy feeling creeping over my skin, sinking deep into my bones. My heart started pounding in my chest. I couldn't figure out why. I wasn't sure what had woken me up, but something was off. Something didn't feel right. I looked around the room, my eyes blurry from sleep, but the living room was still the same. The large windows, the couch, the faint light from the street outside. It was all familiar. Still, something was wrong. I could feel it. Then it started. A loud, jarring bang echoed through the house, and I froze. It was coming from above me, somewhere near the window. My heart skipped a beat, and I sat up straight, my mind racing. Another bang, and then another. It wasn't just one thump. It was consistent, rhythmic, like someone was pounding on the glass. I didn't move. I didn't dare. I couldn't. I stared up at the window, my heart thudding in my chest. There was something out there. I just knew it. I couldn't see through the glass clearly, but I felt like there was someone standing right on the other side, maybe watching me, maybe trying to get my attention. The pounding continued, relentless, like someone was trying to break the glass, like they wanted to get inside. I blinked a few times, trying to shake off the lingering fog of alcohol, but I couldn't. My stomach twisted, my hands went clammy. I looked over at the cable box on the table beside the couch. The time was 3 a.m. It felt like an eternity had passed since I woke up, but only a few minutes had gone by. The banging from the window stopped for a moment, and for a brief second, I thought maybe it was all in my head. Maybe I was just imagining it. But then, a new sound reached my ears. A soft thud at the front door. Someone was knocking on the door. Light, almost tentative, like they weren't sure if anyone was home. I didn't move. I couldn't. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that maybe it was just someone passing by, but deep down I knew. I knew that wasn't the case. The knocking on the door started to pick up speed, faster now, and the banging on the window started again, but this time from two different directions. There was someone at the window and someone at the door. They were both banging, over and over, unrelenting. Whoever wasn't stopping. They didn't care if I was home. They just kept pounding. I lay there, motionless, the fear growing in me like a living thing. I thought about getting up and running to the door to see what was going on, but I knew better. I couldn't do it. Something told me that if I opened that door, I wouldn't like what I found on the other side. The pounding continued for what felt like an eternity. 40 minutes passed, maybe more. Every second felt like a lifetime. I didn't have the guts to look out the window again, but I could hear the muffled sounds of movement outside. Whoever it was, they weren't just standing there. They were circling, moving around, knocking from different angles. I don't know how I kept my composure. I wanted to scream, to shout, but I couldn't. I felt paralyzed, trapped in the house, with nowhere to go and no way to escape. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the banging stopped. Dead silence. It was like someone had turned off a switch. The world outside the house was eerily still. I could hear my own breath, shallow and rapid, and the thumping of my heart in my ears. But there was no more noise, no more knocking or pounding. The silence was deafening. I didn't know how long I stayed there, not moving, not even blinking. My mind was racing, and my body was trembling uncontrollably. I wanted to go to the door to check, but I was terrified. What if they were still out there? What if they were waiting for me to make a move? After what felt like an hour, I finally got up, my legs weak and unsteady beneath me. I tiptoed to the window, peeking through the blinds. I could see nothing. No figures standing there, no movement in the yard. Just the dark, empty street, the trees rustling in the wind. There was no sign of anyone. It was all over, but I didn't feel any relief. If anything, I felt worse, like the calm after a storm. The kind of calm that makes you wonder if the worst is yet to come. I didn't go back to sleep that night. I stayed up, wide-eyed, listening for any sound. Every little creak of the house, every rustle of the wind, made me jump. I was exhausted, but there was no way I could sleep. Not after that. The next day, I called a friend, trying to make sense of what had happened. I didn't want to be alone again, not after what I'd heard, what I'd felt. I needed someone to tell me I wasn't crazy, that there was a logical explanation for the noises. When I told him what happened, he didn't offer any comfort. Instead, he laughed nervously and said, "What the fuck for? So that we can both be murdered in our sleep. Thanks a lot, asshole." That didn't help at all. I didn't go back to the house that night. I stayed at a friend's place, and for the next few days, I didn't sleep well. Every creak of a floorboard, Every faint sound made my heart race. I couldn't stop thinking about the pounding on the windows, the knocking on the door. What do they want? Who were they? And why had they stopped? Eventually, my family came back from vacation, and I tried to tell them what happened, but they just looked at me like I was overreacting. They didn't understand. How could they? No one had experienced what I had. The fear that had gripped me, the feeling that someone was out there just waiting for me to slip up. No one could understand the kind of terror unless they'd lived through it. But I knew one thing for sure. I would never, ever feel safe in that house again. When I was a young child, I had the same dream every night. It was the same one, without fail. I would stand by the edge of a cliff overlooking a vast, angry ocean. The wind would whip around me, pushing my hair into my face, and I'd feel the spray of salt water against my skin. The sky above was dark, heavy with clouds, and I could hear the crash of waves below, loud and menacing, as though the ocean itself were angry with me. In every version of a dream, it happened the same way. I would turn away from the edge of the cliff and start a walk. But no matter which direction I went, I was always drawn back to the water. The air would grow colder and colder, the waves louder, and I could feel the ground under my feet begin to tremble. Then, without warning, a massive wave would rise out of the ocean, higher than any building I'd ever seen. The wave would crash down over me in an instant, pulling me under the water with such force that I'd feel my lungs fill with icy seawater. I'd flail and struggle, but it was useless. I sank deeper and deeper, the world above becoming a distant blur. My chest would tighten, and no matter how much I fought, I couldn't get to the surface. The darkness would close in around me, and I'd wake up gasping for air, my heart racing. It wasn't just once. It wasn't just a bad night's sleep. It was every single night for years. I couldn't escape it. No matter how hard I tried, no matter how many tricks I learned to try to control my dreams, the wave always came, and I always sank. By the time I was in college, I had learned to cope with it. I tried talking to people about it, but it was always dismissed. Some called it a childhood nightmare. Others said it was my brain's way of dealing with stress. I wasn't convinced. There was something about it that felt so real, as though it was trying to tell me something I couldn't quite grasp. But as the years passed, I put the dream behind me. It became just a memory, a story I told when people asked about my childhood nightmares. That summer, I needed money. College tuition was creeping up, and I didn't want to burden my parents with any more debt. So, I took a temporary job delivering mail. It wasn't glamorous, but paid the bills. The job was pretty straightforward. I'd drive to different parts of town, stopping at houses and dropping off packages, letters, whatever needed to be delivered. I didn't have to talk to people much, which was fine by me. I liked the peace and quiet. Most people weren't home anyway, especially during the hot summer months. One afternoon, the boss handed me a route I'd never done before. It was a small neighborhood on the outskirts of town, near the coast. I didn't recognize the streets, but he said it was a simple one, so I didn't think twice. The sun was starting to dip low in the sky when I set off, the cool evening air rolling in from the ocean. The neighborhood was quiet. I pulled up at the first house on my list and got out, carrying a package with a few other letters stuffed under my arm. It was an old house, the kind with white paint peeling from the wooden porch. There was a rocking chair on the porch, but no sign of anyone around. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I left the package on the doorstep and moved on to the next house. It was the third house that made me stop. I pulled up to a little cottage at the end of the street. The house looked like it had been there for years, the kind of place that was once beautiful, but it started to fade with age. The garden was overgrown, and the porch sagged slightly. I didn't think much of it first, but as I walked toward the front door, I saw her. An old woman was sitting on the porch, staring out at the horizon. She didn't seem to notice me at first. She was dressed in an old, faded dress, her hair long and gray, but neat. She looked like she could have been in her late 80s or early 90s. But there was something about the way she was sitting, something unsettling. She looked so still, like she was waiting for something. I didn't think much of it at first. I was used to strange people in strange places. I had a job to do. I knocked on the door, But still, the old woman didn't move. Her eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, as though she didn't even see me. I walked up the steps and placed the package on the porch, careful not to disturb her. I was about to turn around and head back to the truck when she spoke. "You drowned when Oceania sank beneath the waves," she said, her voice low and thick with an accent I couldn't place. Her words hung in the air, heavy and strange. My heart stopped. I wasn't sure if I'd heard her correctly. I turned around to look at her, but she didn't even acknowledge me. Her gaze remained fixed on the horizon, as if she had said nothing at all. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. A cold shiver ran down my spine. There was something about her words that hit me in a way I couldn't explain. It felt wrong, like a part of my soul had been tapped into. I wanted to ask her what she meant, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I turned and quickly walked back to the truck. I could hear my footsteps echo in the silence, but I didn't dare look back. I tossed the keys into the ignition and sped away from the house, my mind racing. The words she said, they didn't make sense. How could she know something like that? I'd never met her before. I didn't even know who she was. And yet, it felt like she was speaking directly to me. As I drove, my thoughts spiraled. The dream, the wave, the sinking, it all came rushing back. The old woman's words echoed in my mind, repeating over and over again like a chant. "You drowned when Oceania sank beneath the waves." It was like the pieces of a puzzle I didn't even know existed were starting to come together. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The dream came back to me as vivid as ever. The same dark sky, the same roaring ocean, the same wave rising up, towering over me. I could feel the cold, the terror, the helplessness as I sank beneath the water. I woke up in a cold sweat, gasping for breath, my heart racing in my chest. It wasn't just a nightmare anymore. It felt like a memory of something that had happened long ago, something I couldn't remember, but somehow knew. The next day, I went back to the same neighborhood. I didn't know why. Maybe I was looking for answers. Maybe I thought I'd misunderstood the old woman. Maybe I just needed to make sense of what happened. I wasn't sure. I pulled up to the same cottage, my hands shaking as I stepped out of the truck. But the house was empty. The porch was empty. There was no sign of the old woman anywhere. I knocked on the door, but no one answered. The place looked even older than before, like it had been abandoned for years. The garden was more overgrown, the porch even more weathered. It was like the house had aged overnight. I didn't know what to make of it. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I didn't want to stay there any longer, so I left and never went back. Months passed. The memory of the old woman and her strange words faded, but I couldn't forget them completely. They lingered in the back of my mind, like a knot that wouldn't untangle. Every now and then, I would think about the dream, about the wave, about her. But life went on. I finished my summer job, went back to school, and tried to move on. But there was always that feeling, that nagging sense that I was missing something important. One day, a few years later, I came across a book in a library. It was about ancient civilizations, lost cultures, and myths from around the world. I wasn't particularly interested, but something about it caught my eye. I flipped through the pages, looking for something to occupy my mind. And then I saw it. Oceania. It wasn't a country. It wasn't a place. It was a myth. A story from the ancient world. A civilization that had supposedly existed long before modern history. A civilization that had been lost beneath the waves. The more I read, the more it felt like the pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. The story told of a great flood, a massive wave that destroyed everything. And in the midst of it all, there was a people who had disappeared, who had drowned when their world sank beneath the ocean. The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. I couldn't breathe. It was like I had always known, but didn't want to admit it. The dream, the old woman, the wave, it all made sense now. I had drowned. Somehow, I had drowned in that flood, and that's why I had always been haunted by the dream. It wasn't just a nightmare. It was a memory of a past life, a memory of something that had happened long before I was born. I don't know how or why it happened. I don't know why I've carried that memory with me for so long, but it's real. It's not just a dream. It's part of me, and somehow I know that the old woman was right. I drowned when Oceania sank beneath the waves. I grew up in a small, rural town in Georgia. Our house was surrounded by thick woods, tall trees that looked like they stretched forever into the night sky. On weekends, my parents were cool enough to let me sleep in the living room. My sister was a light sleeper, and she would always complain if I stayed in the same room with her. So they let me camp out on the couch, especially on Friday and Saturday nights when I could stay up late, watch TV, and enjoy some freedom. The house was quiet at night, the kind of quiet that only comes with being surrounded by woods. And I loved that peace, even if it sometimes felt a bit eerie. I always stayed up late, watching reruns on Nick at Night until I finally couldn't keep my eyes open anymore. It was the routine I had, falling asleep to the hum of old TV shows that seemed to fill the house with a strange sense of comfort. But every now and then, something would make me wake up in the middle of the night, heart racing, instincts firing like a warning bell. One of those nights, I woke up to the kind of feeling that makes the hairs on your neck stand up like a pressure, a tension in the air. It was that sharp, prickly sensation, the kind that told you something wasn't quite right. My eyes snapped open, and without even thinking, I bolted upright. My pulse was already pounding in my ears. I stared out the window in the dark, trying to piece together what felt wrong. The moonlight was bright, casting long shadows that stretched across the front yard, the trees beyond it swaying gently in the wind. It was in that stillness that I saw it. At first, it was just a dark shape blending into the tree line. But then it took form, a silhouette, a figure standing still in the branches of one of the tall pine trees, barely noticeable unless you were really looking for it. For a moment, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but no, it wasn't. It was a person, someone up in that tree just standing there. I couldn't make out any details, just the outline of person. Before I could process it, the family dog, a German Shepherd we'd had for years, darted to the window. She started snarling, low and guttural, her ears pinned back in warning. Her eyes were fixed on the tree where the figure was standing, her whole body tense, ready to spring. That's when I felt the first real jolt of fear. It wasn't just me feeling something wrong anymore. The dog knew it too. And if there's one thing I knew for sure, it was that when the dog acted like that, something wasn't right. I froze. My eyes were glued to the figure in the tree, unable to look away. My heart hammered in my chest, and all I could think about was how I needed to tell my parents. I needed to be sure I wasn't imagining things. Without taking my eyes off the window, I slid off the couch and rushed to my parents' room, my feet barely making a sound on the floor. My hand was shaking so badly that I could barely open the door. I pushed it open and whispered in a frantic, panicked voice, "Mom, Dad, there's someone outside." Dad sat up almost immediately, his eyes wide with concern. It was the middle of the night, and he hadn't been expecting to be pulled into something like this. But I could see the wheels turning in his head. He didn't hesitate for a second. He grabbed a flashlight, and I watched as he fumbled around for something else. He grabbed the shotgun from the corner, the one he kept for protection, and he headed straight for the door without another word. The dog, still on high alert, followed close behind him, barking as they disappeared into the yard. I stood there, terrified, clutching the door frame, waiting for what felt like forever. My mom, still in bed, pulled me close, her arms wrapping around me as she whispered calming words, though I could tell she was just as scared as I was. We both listened closely for any sounds of movement outside, anything that might tell us what was going on. But all we heard was the wind rustling the leaves and the occasional bark from the dog. After what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes, I heard Dad's voice outside, low and steady, calling the dog back. He came back inside, holding the shotgun loosely in his hand, his face expressionless. He looked at me, then at Mom, and said, "There's no one out there." I didn't see anything. It was probably just a raccoon or something. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe it was nothing. But something in my gut told me it wasn't. I knew what I had seen, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it wasn't just some animal. My heart didn't stop pounding until Dad ushered me back to my room and made me go back to sleep. It was hard to argue though. What else could we do? He'd checked the property and he didn't see anything. If there was someone out there, they were gone now. So I climbed into bed, trying to calm my racing heart, but sleep didn't come easy. I kept thinking about that figure in the tree, about the way the dog had reacted. It didn't make sense. I was too scared to close my eyes, but eventually exhaustion took over. I lay there, listening to the faint creaks of the house and the wind whistling through the trees. I woke up again. This time it was quieter. The moon was still shining through the window, but everything seemed still. Too still. My body felt tense, like I was holding my breath. I shifted slightly, pulling myself into a sitting position. I looked out the window again, half expecting to see the figure in the tree again, but the yard was empty. I couldn't see a thing. But then my stomach dropped. I could see him, the man. He was standing just outside my window, his figure clearly visible in the moonlight. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but I couldn't. I couldn't move. He was looking straight at me, and as I stared back at him, he raised his finger to his lips in that unmistakable shush motion. And then, without another sound, he turned and started running away from the house, disappearing into the dark woods. I didn't know what to do. My mind was racing. My heart was in my throat. All I could think about was getting out of that room, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear, tears starting to spill down my cheeks. I felt completely helpless. I wanted to run to my parents, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from that spot by the window, my whole body shaking. I stayed there for what felt like hours, my thoughts racing a mile a minute, wondering if I was going crazy. Why had he done that? Why had he just stared at me, then run away like nothing happened? Had it been some sick joke? A threat? I didn't know. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I ran down the hallway, barely making any noise as I stumbled into my parents' room. I tried to explain what had happened again, but this time, my dad didn't say anything. He just pulled me into his arms, and I could feel his chest heaving as he took a deep breath. He didn't need to say anything. We both knew. Something was wrong. The next morning, Dad made a few calls, had a couple of his friends come over, and did another thorough sweep of the property. They didn't find anything. No footprints, no signs of anyone coming or going. They didn't even find anything in the trees. But I knew what I'd seen, and so did the dog. That wasn't something I'd imagined. The man never came back. Over the years, I've thought about that night countless times. I still wonder who he was, what he wanted, why he came so close to my window. But most of all, I wonder if he'll ever return. That night changed everything. It was the kind of thing that sticks with you, something that lingers in the back of your mind, no matter how hard you try to push it away. Because when someone crosses that line into your world like that, you can't ever forget it. You can't ever feel truly safe again. And to this day, every time I hear a noise in the woods near my house, I remember that figure in the tree, that man who watched me in the dark. I don't know who he was, but I know I'm not imagining things. I know he was real, and I know he's out there. It was a warm summer night, and the air felt thick with humidity as I hopped on my bike for a midnight ride. The streets were quiet, and the cool breeze against my skin felt like a gentle reminder that the night was still young. My friend had been with me for most of the ride, but as the night wore on, we decided to part ways. I had about 2 blocks left to go before I reached home, so it was nothing really. Just a quick ride through the almost deserted streets. The city I lived in wasn't massive, but it wasn't exactly small either. It was a downtown area, a bit rough around the edges with lots of old brick buildings, alleys, and narrow sidewalks. The streets were usually pretty empty at this hour, especially on weeknights, so it wasn't uncommon for me to ride alone at night. But tonight felt different. Maybe it was because it was so quiet. Maybe it was the heavy, still air, but something felt off. I couldn't really put my finger on it, but I noticed it the moment my friend and I split up. The street was eerily empty as I made my way down, the only sound being the soft hum of my bike tires against the concrete. I had to ride on the sidewalk because of some construction that was blocking the road, and though it wasn't a huge inconvenience, it did make things feel a little more cramped. The sidewalk was narrow, barely wide enough for a person to walk, let alone ride a bike. I kept my speed moderate, trying to avoid any surprises. I always took these streets at night, so I was used to them, but tonight there was something unsettling about the silence. I made a left turn onto my street, the familiar corner I'd turned 1,000 times before, but tonight, as I was about to swing around, I saw him. He was walking in the opposite direction, a man in his 40s, maybe a little older, scruffy looking, but not homeless. He had an unkempt beard and was wearing a faded t-shirt and jeans that looked a little too big for him. It wasn't his appearance that caught my attention though. It was the way he moved. He didn't seem in any particular hurry, but there was something off about his posture, his gait. His head was down, almost as if he didn't notice me until I got closer. The sidewalk was narrow, and with no other option, I had to pass by him. I didn't want to startle him, so I called out, "Hey, behind you!" It was a simple warning, nothing aggressive, just something to let him know I was coming up behind him. I had no intention of freaking him out, and I didn't think I would, but when he turned around and looked at me, I felt a chill run down my spine. His eyes were wide, and there was an immediate flash of anger in his face. His expression twisted into a scowl, and he glared at me, his face red with frustration. "Fuck off," he shouted, his voice hoarse and full of venom. I didn't understand what had just happened. I had only warned him, nothing more. But he seemed genuinely enraged, as though I had done something to provoke him. It was unnerving, but I didn't want to stick around and make the situation worse. So I quickly turned onto my street. It wasn't a huge deal, but it was enough to make me feel uneasy. As I pedaled down my street, I heard his voice again, this time louder. "You're a fucking cunt. I'll kill you," he screamed, his words filled with hatred. My heart rate quickened, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I looked over my shoulder, and there he was, following me. He wasn't just walking, he was practically marching after me, his footsteps heavy on the pavement. His voice was growing more frantic with each passing second, but I couldn't make out all the words. I could only hear bits and pieces like, "I'll fucking get you," and "You're gonna regret this." I started pedaling faster, trying to put some distance between us. My house was just ahead, and I didn't want him to know where I lived. It was a quiet street, and I didn't want to risk him following me right to my front door. The thought of him showing up at my house made my stomach turn. I had to think quickly. Without hesitation, I decided to ride around the block. It wasn't the most logical thing to do, but it felt like the only option. I wasn't ready to go home yet, not with him still on my tail. So I kept pedaling, circling the block in a wide loop, trying to lose him in the quiet streets. I glanced back as I rounded the corner, but he was still behind me, following without hesitation. I could hear his angry shouts, though they grew more distant as I picked up speed. It didn't take long for me to make another lap around the block, but when I came back to the same corner, something made my stomach drop. There, standing on my front stoop, was the man. He wasn't walking anymore. He wasn't chasing me. He was standing still, staring out at the street like he knew exactly where I lived. My heart skipped a beat. How had he gotten there so fast? I hadn't seen him turn onto the street, hadn't heard his footsteps follow me in the direction I had gone. He was just there, standing on my stoop like he had been waiting for me. I didn't stop to figure out how he had gotten there. I didn't even look back as I rode past the house again. I just kept pedaling faster this time, as if I could outrun the fear that was gnawing at my insides. I passed him again, and though he saw me, he didn't say anything. He just stood there, staring. I didn't know what to do. I wasn't sure if he was waiting for me to come home, if he was trying to figure out where I lived, or if he just enjoyed the fear he was causing me. Either way, I wasn't willing to stick around and find out. So I rode back to my friend's place. When I finally reached her house, I was out of breath, my mind racing with thoughts of that man. My palms were sweaty, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. But I didn't want to freak her out, so I didn't mention it. I just hung out for a bit, trying to calm myself down. The next 2 days were a blur. I was still on edge, and I couldn't shake the image of that man standing on my stoop. I kept thinking about how he knew where I lived, how he had been so quick to show up there after I made my loop. It didn't sit well with me. Then, 2 days later, I came outside to find that my bike was gone. It wasn't just misplaced or moved to a different spot. It had been stolen. It had been locked up in the alleyway by my house, and now it was gone. All that was left was the broken lock and the feeling that someone had been watching. I texted my mom right away. I was shaken, but I didn't want to overreact. I didn't want to call the cops on the guy for something that might just be a coincidence. But my mom wasn't having it. She told me to be cautious, not to go home alone at night anymore, and to stay with friends if I had to. It wasn't until I told her about the bike that she decided we should call the police. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. They never found the bike and they never caught the guy. I don't know what his deal was or why he followed me that night. Maybe he was just another lost soul roaming the streets, or maybe there was something more sinister behind it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he had been watching me for a while, waiting for the right moment. I still don't know if I'll ever find out who he was or what his intentions were. But that night, I learned to trust my instincts. There's something about the way people move, the way they look at you, that can tell you everything you need to know. And even now, I don't ride alone at night anymore. Not through those streets. Not after everything that happened. I had just left my family reunion, and the clock was creeping up on midnight. I was exhausted, but I had to get back to work the next morning. It was a 2-hour drive, but I wasn't sure I was going to make it that far without pulling over to sleep. I've made long drives before, but this was different. My mind was foggy, and I was struggling to keep my eyes open. The thought of my bed was tempting, but I knew I couldn't afford to nap. I'd already taken too long, and the last thing I needed was to get to work late. The route home was a winding road, flanked by dense bushes and trees on either side. The kind of setting you see in those creepy movies, the dark, narrow roads where anything could be lurking just beyond your headlights. The roads were lonely. Every few minutes, I'd pass the occasional car, but mostly I was on my own with nothing but the sound of my tires on the asphalt and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I tried to shake off the exhaustion, but it was impossible. My eyelids kept drooping, and the light from my dashboard was beginning to blur. After about 45 minutes, I started to feel it. That overwhelming, sudden tiredness that you can't control, like a weight pressing down on your eyes. I didn't want to stop, but I also knew I wasn't going to last much longer. The road was familiar enough, but it still didn't sit right with me to just pull over. There were no gas stations or pull-offs anywhere around here. Just endless, dense trees and more trees. I passed a few houses every now and then, but it was mostly just darkness and a few headlights from passing cars. There wasn't any place that screamed safe. I finally made the decision, one I knew was questionable as soon as I thought it. I pulled over to the side of the road. It was one of those small, grass-covered areas between two bends, flanked by tall bushes. The trees surrounding me created a dense barrier that kept anyone from seeing me unless they got really close. Maybe that was my thinking. If someone came by, they wouldn't be able to see me from the road. It was a bad decision. I knew it, but I had no choice. I turned off the engine, set my alarm, and looked at the time. It was 11:22 p.m. The moment my head hit the headrest, I was out. The quiet of the night enveloped me, and I drifted off into a deep, much-needed sleep. I don't know how long I'd been asleep when I heard it, the scratching. It was soft at first, almost like a nail dragging across metal. It was coming from the back of my car. My heart jumped, and my eyes snapped open. The first thing I did was check the time, 11:50 p.m. It had only been 28 minutes since I'd fallen asleep, and yet here I was, wide awake with a creeping feeling gnawing at the back of my mind. I hesitated, unsure of what to do. The scratching stopped as quickly as it started, and I sat there in silence for a few moments. Maybe it was just an animal, raccoon, a squirrel, or some other critter nosing around. It made sense, right? There's a lot of wildlife in this area. I tried to calm myself, brushing off the tension that had built up in my chest. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I could feel the quiet pressing down on me, and I didn't like it. I turned back around, trying to convince myself it was nothing, and slowly drifted back into a light sleep. But then, again, I was jolted awake. The scratching had returned, but this time, it was louder, more persistent. I glanced at the clock, panic tightening in my chest. 12:40 a.m. The noise continued, dragging across the back of my car, echoing in the stillness of the night. I sat frozen for a moment, trying to figure out what it was, what could be causing it. An animal again? It didn't seem right. Why would it come back after almost an hour? That wasn't typical animal behavior. I couldn't bring myself to look outside. I didn't want to. Something in my gut told me not to, but I couldn't just ignore it. I reluctantly turned my head to the rearview mirror, only catching a glimpse of something. A shadow, too quick to make out, darting into the woods. My heart thudded. Something or someone had been right behind me. I didn't want to think about it, but the stories ran through my mind. Stories of people getting attacked after pulling over in the wrong spot, carjacked in the middle of nowhere. Stories I'd heard as a kid. The hook killer, the one that scratched cars and attacked the people who investigated. It was crazy, but I couldn't shake the thought. Without wasting another second, I started my car and drove off. I needed to get the hell out of there. I pushed the accelerator down, the engine roaring to life. The dense trees rushed past as I tried to shake off the heavy feeling in my stomach. I had only made it a few hundred yards when I hit a bend in the road. There, parked off to the side, was another car. It was an older model sedan, its driver's side door wide open. I slowed down, a sick feeling creeping in my throat. The car was empty. There was no one in sight. My heart raced, my mind going into overdrive. What the hell was going on? Why was this car just sitting there? I couldn't afford to stop and figure out. I kept driving, but I couldn't shake the image of that abandoned car. I was halfway around the bend when it happened. I glanced in my rearview mirror, and that's when I saw him. The figure burst around the corner, sprinting toward my car. I could see his wild movements as he ran, arms flailing, a crazed look in his eyes. He was shouting, but I couldn't make out the words. Only the harsh, frantic scream of, "Hey, hey you, get the fuck out of your car. Now." My blood ran cold. I didn't think, didn't hesitate. I hit the gas and sped away. I didn't look back. The road stretched out in front of me, empty now. I just drove as fast as I could, heart pounding, until the fear slowly started to fade. I never saw that guy again. I don't know who he was or what he wanted. Maybe it was just some random guy who saw an opportunity, maybe not. But I knew one thing for sure. I was never pulling over on the side of a deserted road again, especially not at night. It was one of those moments where you realize how easily things can go wrong when you make the wrong decision. And the worst part is, it's not always obvious when you're making the wrong choice. That night, I was just tired, trying to find a safe place to rest. But in the end, what I thought was safe turned out to be anything but. I learned my lesson. Never trust your instincts in places like that, especially when you're alone. And above all, never, ever pull over on a deserted road late at night. A few years ago, I decided to take a walk through the woods near my house. The kind of woods that most people avoid, the kind where you don't hear much from the outside world. It was quiet, peaceful, but there was something different about the air that day. The smell was thick, almost overwhelming. It wasn't something you'd expect to come from nature. It didn't smell like earth or pine or damp leaves. It was sweet, so sweet it made my stomach turn, but not in the way flowers or ripe fruit would. It was sickly sweet, like something that had been left out in the sun too long. I kept walking, figuring it was just my imagination or maybe some flower I didn't recognize. But the smell lingered. It didn't fade as I walked deeper into the woods. In fact, it got stronger, and I started to feel a little uneasy. The woods were quiet, too quiet. The usual rustling of animals or birds calling was gone. I should have turned around right then, but I didn't. I've always had a bit of a curious streak, and this smell was gnawing at me. I pushed through some undergrowth, moving cautiously but driven by some need to know. The closer I got to the source, the more nauseating the smell became. When I finally parted the last of the thick bushes and looked down, I froze. There on the ground was a body. At first, I couldn't even tell what it was. It was so swollen and misshapen that it looked like some kind of grotesque sculpture rather than a person. The skin was a mottled green and black, and there were patches of it that looked like they'd been eaten away by something. I could see the remnants of where the local wildlife had been feeding on him. Maggots wriggled in the exposed areas, and the smell, it wasn't just sickly sweet anymore. It was rancid, thick, and suffocating. I stepped back, horrified, but my mind was racing. What should I do? I couldn't just leave him out here, but I didn't want to touch anything either. I stood there for what felt like forever, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. It wasn't until I pulled myself together that I thought to call the police. I dialed the number, my hands trembling as I explained the situation. The operator was calm, almost too calm, like they'd gotten similar calls before. They asked for my location, told me to stay with the body, and that they would send someone out right away. My heart dropped at the thought of staying there, alone, in the woods with that body. The sun was starting to set, and the light was fading fast. I could hear the wind starting to pick up, and the sounds of the woods had returned, but they didn't comfort me. The birds, the insects, they were all giving me an eerie feeling like they were waiting for something. I sat down a few feet from the body, my back pressed against a tree, trying to keep my focus. The air was getting cooler, the kind of chill that settles in when the sun goes down, but I didn't move. I couldn't. I kept glancing at the body, unable to look away. Every rustle in the underbrush made my stomach lurch. Was it an animal coming back? Or something worse? I tried to distract myself by thinking about anything else. What had happened to this man? How long had he been out here? Was he left to rot by someone? Or had he ended his own life? I hadn't seen any signs of struggle. The body wasn't bound or anything like that. Just lifeless. The sight of him, his swollen, grotesque features, made me want to gag. I wanted to leave, but I didn't dare. The police had told me to wait, and that's exactly what I did. As the minutes stretched into hours, the darkness crept in. It was no longer just the fading light of the day. It was a thick, suffocating blackness that felt like it was pressing in on me from all sides. I could hardly see the body anymore, just the vague silhouette of it in the darkness. But the smell was still there, stronger than ever. It seemed to take on a life of its own, seeping into the air, into my clothes, into my lungs. I heard the occasional crack of branches or the shuffle of leaves, but I wasn't sure if it was the wind or something else. The silence had returned to the woods, broken only by the sound of my own breathing. My heart was pounding in my chest. It was stupid, but I was terrified. What if the police didn't show up? What if I was stuck out here alone with this body for hours, maybe longer? And then, just as the panic was starting to set in, I heard the faint hum of a car in the distance. My heart leaped to my chest. It was the police. They were finally here. The headlights broke through the trees, and the car came to stop just a few feet from where I sat. 2 officers got out, one of them tall, with graying hair and a stern look. The other was younger, with short-cropped hair, scanning the area. I stood up, relieved but still shaken. They both glanced at me and then at the body. "We'll take it from here," the older officer said. He didn't sound unkind, but his tone was businesslike. They moved quickly, securing the scene and taking notes. One of the officers took photos while the other inspected the body. I stayed in the background, not knowing what to do with myself. After a while, the younger officer came over to me and spoke in a low voice. He committed suicide, he said, almost like he was offering me some kind of explanation. Hung himself, from what we can tell. Looks like he's been out here for a while. We'll take care of the rest. That was it. No more questions, no more explanations. They didn't seem interested in me any further. I guess there wasn't much to say, but the finality of it hit me hard. This man had been out there, all alone, dying, and I'd been the one to find him. I left the woods that night with a strange, heavy feeling. It wasn't relief, it wasn't closure. It was something else, something I couldn't shake. For the next few weeks, I couldn't stop thinking about that body, about how he'd been alone, how long he'd been out there, how he must have felt in his last moments. I tried to bury it, tried to focus on anything else, but his face kept haunting me. I couldn't forget the way he looked, swollen, pale, and lifeless. Every time I closed my eyes, his image flashed in my mind, and then the dreams started. At first, they were just brief, disjointed images. I would be walking through the woods again, only this time, I could feel his presence behind me. Sometimes I would hear him, his voice low and angry, calling me. Other times, I would see his face, twisted in pain and fury. His eyes, those eyes, they were open, staring at me, but I couldn't tell if they were accusing me or begging me to do something. The dreams grew worse. They became more vivid. I would wake up, drenched in sweat, my heart racing, the feeling of his eyes still heavy on me. The voice in my dreams, always angry, always demanding something from me, never stopped. He wanted me to join him, to do what he had done. He wanted me to end it, too. It was almost as if he blamed me for disturbing his resting place. He had been left alone, forgotten in the woods, and I had ruined that. He had wanted peace, and I had taken it from him. It was always the same, night after night. And the more I tried to push him out of my mind, the more he stayed. I couldn't get away from him. I don't know how long it went on, weeks, maybe months, but eventually I did what I thought would help. I went back to the woods. I didn't want to, but I thought maybe I could find some kind of closure. Maybe if I saw the place again, I could rid myself of the nightmares. When I got to the spot, everything had changed. The undergrowth had started to reclaim the area, and the trees had grown thick again. It was quiet, peaceful even, but something felt off. There was no sign of the body, no remnants, no trace of what had happened. It was like it had never been there. I stood there for a long time, looking around, but I didn't feel the sense of dread I had expected. I didn't know what to make of it, but when I left, it felt like the weight had been lifted a little. Maybe it was the fact that I'd confronted the place. Maybe it was the peace of the woods finally settling in my mind, but I never had those dreams again. Not after that day. I still think about it, though. About him. About how he died alone in those woods. And sometimes when I'm walking through the trees or sitting quietly at night, I can almost smell that sweetness again, just for a second. It's faint, but it's there. I don't know if it's my mind playing tricks on me or something else, but I think I've made peace with it. He's gone now, and I'm still here, moving forward. That's all I can do. But sometimes, just sometimes, when the night is quiet and the air is still, I wonder if he's out there, waiting, watching, still angry that I disturbed his resting place. I'm not sure what happened that night, but it changed everything for me. It started as just another trip, a weekend in the mountains to get away from the noise of the city. I thought it'd be peaceful. I'd be out in nature, just me and my thoughts. But by the end of it, I was questioning everything. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe it was something else, something that I still can't quite explain. I'd been to that area before. A few years back, I spent a couple of nights camping there, alone, but I never had anything strange happen. It's a place I like, nestled in the foothills of the mountains, about 2 hours from where I live. You get a mix of quiet woods and high, rocky ridges, and the lake is calm enough that you could think it was man-made, even though it's not. I set out to get back to that spot and do some solo hiking. I was feeling restless, the kind of restlessness that only a few days in the wilderness can fix. I drove up in my truck, packed with the usual camping gear: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and a few other things to keep me busy for a few days. When I reached the parking area near the trailhead, there were a few other cars, but nothing that screamed crowded. I took a look around, the trees heavy with the last of autumn's color, the air crisp but not cold, just right for hiking. It felt like the perfect time to get out there. I locked up the truck and began to hike up the trail. It was one of those trails where you start off easy, gentle incline, not much effort. It was still morning, the sun shining through the trees, birds calling, the occasional rustle of leaves underfoot. Nothing was out of the ordinary. I took a few breaks, drinking water and catching my breath, trying to pace myself. The further I went, the more I felt the isolation, but it was the good kind, the kind where the only sounds are your own footfalls and the wind through the trees. After about 3 hours, I arrived at the lake. It was quiet, just the way I remembered it. The sun had moved higher in the sky, but the air was still cool. I set up camp on the far side of the lake, just off the trail, but hidden enough that no one would wander by and see my tent. It wasn't much of a campsite, just a small clearing, some tall pines around me, but it was enough. I gathered some firewood and set up the campfire, thinking I'd be fine for the night. The afternoon passed without anything remarkable happening. I made myself dinner, enjoyed the solitude, and then sat back by the fire as the sun set. It was that golden hour when the light turns soft and everything around you feels like it's in slow motion. It was peaceful, maybe too peaceful. As the night crept in, the forest around me grew darker, quieter. The fire crackled and popped. I couldn't see the stars because of the trees, but I knew they were there, hidden behind a canopy of leaves and branches. The only light was from the fire and my headlamp. I was getting ready to turn in for the night when I heard it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the wind, but it came again, this time clearer. The sound of footsteps. Not animal footsteps, but human. They weren't heavy, like someone trudging along. They were light, deliberate, almost sneaky. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe someone else was camping nearby, or maybe it was a hiker passing through. But as I sat there, staring into the fire, the sound came again, closer this time. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My breath caught on my chest. I stood up and grabbed my flashlight, trying to act calm, trying not to make too much noise. I walked a little ways from the camp, shining the light into the trees. Nothing. The forest was still, too still. I couldn't hear anything except the wind and my own breath. I convinced myself it was an animal, maybe a deer, maybe something else, just a fluke. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. It was the way the steps sounded, almost too methodical, too quiet for any animal I could think of. I walked back to my camp and sat down by the fire again, trying to shake off the unease. I ate a little more, but my appetite was gone. I kept the fire going a little longer, hoping the light would make me feel safer. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. As the night wore on, I kept hearing the footsteps, but they never got closer. Sometimes I thought they were behind me, sometimes off to the side, but they never came into my view. It was like someone was circling me, moving just out of sight. I decided to get into my tent. I didn't feel like I was going to get any sleep, but I figured it might help me calm down. I zipped myself inside, keeping the flashlight in my hand. The silence outside was so complete that it was almost unnatural. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just the quiet hum of my own thoughts. I lay there, staring at the ceiling of the tent, listening for any more sounds. But all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. Minutes stretched on, feeling like hours. I couldn't stop imagining what might be out there, just beyond the edge of the firelight. Suddenly, there was a loud snap from outside, like a twig breaking. My heart skipped. I held my breath, waiting, but nothing came after that. No footsteps, no movement, just the eerie silence again. I must have drifted off at some point because the next thing I knew, I was waking up to the sound of something scratching at the side of the tent. I froze. My mind raced. Was it an animal? A bear? No, it wasn't the sound of claws on fabric. It was something else, something deliberate, something human. I reached for my knife, which was tucked beside me in my sleeping bag. I didn't know what I was going to do with it, but I knew I needed something. The scratching continued, slow and rhythmic. I wanted to scream, but I knew that would only make things worse. I lay there, the air thick with fear, waiting for the scratching to stop. But it didn't. It went on, growing louder, more persistent. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I waited a few more minutes, straining to hear anything. Nothing. No footsteps, no noise. Just silence. I didn't dare move. The minutes dragged on, each one longer than the last. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was out there. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to stick my head out. There was nothing. No one. Just the empty campsite. The fire burned down to embers. The trees loomed dark and silent around me. But there, just beyond the firelight, were marks in the dirt, small and deliberate. Footprints. Fresh ones. I couldn't tell if they were from someone walking around or from someone waiting. I felt sick to my stomach. The footsteps from earlier, they weren't just a fluke. Whoever had been circling me was still out there, and they were close. I decided I wasn't staying another minute. I packed up my tent as fast as I could, my hands shaking. I didn't bother with a full setup, just enough to get my gear together. I wasn't thinking clearly, but I knew I had to leave. I made my way back to the trail, keeping my eyes on every shadow, every rustling branch, every sound in the dark. It was like the forest had closed in around me. Every step I took felt heavier, like I was dragging the whole mountain with me. I didn't stop until I reached the parking lot. It was nearly dawn by the time I got back, the sky lightening in the east. I didn't care. I got in my truck, started the engine, and drove off without a second thought. As I left, I looked back at the mountain. The road ahead was empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, had been watching me the whole time. We were just kids back then, high schoolers, maybe 16 or 17, thinking we were tougher than we were, smarter than we were, and ready for anything the woods could throw at us. That weekend had been planned for months. It was early fall, The kind of weather where the mornings are crisp but not too cold, and the days are still warm enough to sweat through your shirt if you're carrying a heavy pack. There were 5 of us, me, Josh, Mark, Evan, and Tyler. We'd all grown up in a small town surrounded by forests and hills, so the idea of hiking out far into mountains and camping away from everything felt right. Like something we had to do before we all went our separate ways after graduation. We packed light, but enough to get by. Tents, sleeping bags, ramen packets, trail mix, a bunch of jerky, and one of those little gas stoves you screw a canister onto. We each brought a flashlight, a knife, some water, and maybe too much confidence. None of us brought a gun. None of us thought we'd need one. The hike out took most of the day. We started early, around 7 a.m., and walked deep into the woods along a trail that slowly faded into nothing. We weren't on a map anymore, just following a general direction, weaving through trees, climbing over boulders, stepping around fallen logs. The canopy thickened as we got deeper in. Pine needles underfoot soaked up the sound of our boots. Everything felt hushed, like the woods were waiting for something. We joked, told dumb stories, tried to freak each other out with bear attack tales. But as the sun started to dip lower in the sky, the joking slowed down. Our feet were dragging. Our shoulders ached from the packs. I remember looking at Josh and seeing how pale his face had gotten. None of us were in great shape. By the time we found a flat spot big enough to pitch 2 tents, we were done. Not tired done, but barely talked to each other done. The clearing we found was maybe 20 feet across, ringed in with trees. One big pine tree on the edge had a trunk so wide I couldn't have wrapped my arms around it. We threw our packs down, set up the tents in silence, and lit the stove just long enough to boil some water. We passed around ramen in shared plastic bowls, barely talking, just slurping and chewing like animals. I think I was the first one to crawl into my sleeping bag. The air had started to bite, and the cold felt good on my sore legs. The inside of the tent smelled like dirt and old sweat, but I didn't care. I stretched out, listened to the zippers going up in the other tent, and let my body sink into the thin foam mat. I remember hearing the last of the firewood crackle outside, then silence. The woods at night are different. When you live in town, even a small town, there's always a hum. Cars, electric lines, people. Out here, it was quiet but not empty. There were sounds I couldn't place. Cracks, distant pops, a kind of breathing sound that wasn't breathing, trees shifting maybe, or animals far off. But I couldn't sleep. My body was exhausted, but my mind was too wired, keyed up from the hike and the cold and the weird silence pressing in around the tent. The fabric rustled every time I shifted, and I tried to stay still. I don't know how long I lay there, maybe an hour, maybe more, before I heard it. Just a faint sound at first, a rustling, a thump, then a crunch, something stepping on dry ground. I held my breath and listened. It came again, slow, heavy, just one step, then nothing, then another step, closer. I thought maybe it was one of the guys going to pee, but no one said anything. No zipper sound, no light, and then I heard another sound, not the same, from the opposite side of the tent. Another footstep, closer, then another, and another. It was like I was being circled. No running, no growling, just steady steps, moving around the tent like someone or something was pacing just at the edge of where I could see. My heart started to beat faster, but I didn't move. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling of the tent, hearing the soft crunching of leaves and twigs outside. Footsteps too light to be a bear, but too sure and slow to be raccoons or squirrels. They didn't scatter. They didn't make a fuss. It was like they were planning something. I told myself to stop being stupid. I told myself it was probably deer or elk or maybe even just my imagination working against me. But my hand went for the flashlight anyway, slow and careful. I didn't want to make noise. I didn't want whatever was out there to know I was listening. When I finally grabbed the light, I clicked it on and held it to my chest. I didn't shine it right away. I waited, trying to time it between the steps. I don't know what I thought I was going to see, but I needed to look. I couldn't just lay there and wonder. Then I heard a sound right behind the tent. Something big stepped on a branch, and it snapped loud. I jolted, and in that second flicked the flashlight toward the noise. The tent lit up inside and spilled light through the mesh screen onto the trees beyond. That's when I saw them. Eyes. Not just one pair. Several. 5 or 6 at least. all glowing in the light, high off the ground, not low like a fox or raccoon, not even medium height like a big dog. These were higher, eye level, my eye level, maybe higher than me if I had been standing. They didn't blink, they didn't move, just those shining dots reflecting the beam of my flashlight, all staring straight at me. I couldn't breathe. I didn't shout. I didn't move. It felt like my skin turned to ice. I held the light there, hands shaking now, and still the eyes didn't budge. I remember thinking, what the hell kind of animal stands that still, that tall, with that many others beside it? I must have made a sound, maybe a breath, maybe the light flickered, I don't know. But one of them turned its head, just a little. I saw the eyes shift to the side. Then another one moved, slowly, then another. It was like they were deciding what to do. Not scared, just thinking. That's when I noticed something in the way they moved, the slow steps, the quiet feet, the smoothness. And something clicked in my head, something I'd seen 100 times in the woods or crossing roads at dusk. Deer. I realized it slowly. The height, the numbers, the way they stood still and quiet. They weren't predators. They were deer. A whole herd of them. Big ones too. Probably bucks. Their eyes had that same glassy, glowing look you see when your headlights catch them on a back road. I let out a shaky breath. I think I even laughed just a little. Quiet, into my hand. It had felt like something was hunting me, watching, stalking. But it was just deer. Curious, silent deer. Maybe they'd smelled our food or just wandered into the clearing while we slept. Maybe we were in their spot. I lowered the flashlight a little, and the light broke away from their faces. One by one, the eyes blinked out as they turned, melted into the trees. Their steps didn't make much sound. Within moments, it was like they'd never been there. The woods were dark again, the only sound my own breath and my heart slowing down. I turned the flashlight off and lay back on my mat, staring at the tent's roof. I didn't fall asleep for a long time. Every little sound kept me alert. A twig snapping, a breeze shifting the leaves. Everything made me think they were back. But nothing else happened, just the night. In the morning, I stepped outside, and there were prints everywhere. Hoof marks in the dirt, in the soft pine needles around the tents. A few had gotten close, really close. One print was maybe 6 inches from where my head had been. The others came out of their tent and stretched, yawning and complaining about their backs and sore legs. None of them had heard a thing. I didn't say much right away, not because I didn't want to scare them, but because I was still trying to put it into words. When I told them later that day, while we sat by a small fire drinking instant coffee, they laughed. They said it must have freaked me out, and they were right. It had, more than I wanted to admit. We stayed another night, and nothing else happened. No sounds, no eyes, just wind and cold and the crackle of pine cones in the fire. But I didn't sleep easy. I kept waking up, listening, waiting for footsteps. The thing is, I'd seen deer my whole life. I'd hunted them with my dad, watched them in fields at dusk, but I'd never seen them like that, in the dark, in numbers, tall and silent and watching. And ever since that trip, I've never looked at a herd of deer the same way again. I grew up in a small town where camping was as much a part of life as school or playing sports. Every summer, my family would make the trek to a local state park for a few days of camping. We weren't the kind of people who set up on the well-worn campsites where everyone else stayed. We liked the more secluded areas, tucked away in the woods, where it felt like you were the only ones on Earth. When I was around 14 or 15, I had a friend named Matt who loved the woods as much as I did. We'd spent so many nights exploring the area that it felt like second nature to us. It was a tradition, something we called the ritual. Every night, after dinner and while the campfire was still burning, we'd slip away from our families and wander through the woods. We'd turn off our flashlights, daring ourselves to navigate the dense trees by the faint light of the moon. It was something about the darkness that made it exciting. We knew the woods pretty well by that point, so we didn't think much of it. But this night was different. For some reason, maybe because we were getting older, we decided to push further into the woods than we had before. Usually, we stuck to the areas just beyond the campsites, but tonight we kept walking. We were about half a mile from the nearest group of campers when the familiar silence of the woods started to feel heavier, more oppressive. At first, it was just the sounds of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves. The night was cool, but not uncomfortable, and the air smelled fresh, like pine and damp earth. We liked it out here, just the two of us, away from the noise of the campgrounds. Then it happened. We heard something. It was soft, barely noticeable at first, just a faint whisper that seemed to float in on the breeze. It was like someone was talking from far away, too far for us to make out what they were saying. I glanced over at Matt, my heart rate picking up a little. He must have heard it too, because he turned to me with a look of confusion. We paused, standing still in the darkness. The whispering continued, just behind us, closer this time like it was right there. My gut twisted into a tight knot. "Turn off the light," Matt whispered, his voice low. I turned off the flashlight, and for a few seconds, the woods were pitch black around us, save for the dim outline of the trees and the faint stars above. The whispering stopped as soon as the light went out, and we stood there in the silence, listening. Nothing. I let out a breath, shaking off the unease that was creeping in. Maybe it was just the wind, maybe an animal, I thought. But I had this feeling, this gnawing feeling in my gut that told me something wasn't right. We started walking again, this time a little faster, but we kept our flashlights off, moving slowly in case we missed something. The whispering started again, but it wasn't as faint this time. It was louder, closer, like it was right behind us. I whipped around, shining my flashlight in a wide arc. The beams swept over the trees, the brush, but there was nothing. "Did you hear that?" I said, my voice barely a whisper. Matt nodded, his face pale in the flashlight's glow. "Yeah, it's coming from over there." We both turned toward the direction he pointed. The trees were thick here, the underbrush dense, but there was nothing, no movement, no sign of life, just the rustling of leaves in the wind. Still, that whispering kept on. It wasn't words at first, just soft, unintelligible sounds that didn't make any sense. I was about to speak, to tell Matt we should head back, when the whispering stopped. The sudden silence made my ears ring, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I've never been someone to spook easily, but in that moment, the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. We decided to stop. Matt and I exchanged a nervous glance, and I could tell he was just as shaken as I was. We listened for a while, straining our ears. The woods were quiet now, almost unnaturally so. And then, just when I thought maybe we were hearing things, I saw it. At first, it was just a shape in the shadows, something moving slowly across the forest floor. My heart stopped. It was crouching, its body low to the ground, moving with an unsettling crawl. It looked like a person, but it wasn't walking, not normally anyway. It was almost like it was dragging itself, inching forward on all fours. The way it moved was unnatural, jerky, as if it was struggling to get somewhere. I froze, paralyzed with fear, staring at it in disbelief. The whispering started again, only this time it was clearer, closer. It was a woman's voice, soft and eerie, mumbling things that didn't make sense. Matt's voice cut through the air, hoarse and full of tension. "What the hell is that?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But the figure, this woman, kept crawling towards us. She was covered in dirt, her clothes ragged and dark, blending into the shadows of the forest. Her face was obscured, hidden in the darkness, but her movements were unmistakable. I wanted to run, to turn around and bolt back to camp, but my legs felt like they were glued to the spot. The only sound I could hear now was the whispering, her voice growing louder, but still not making sense. And then, as if sensing that we were watching, the woman stopped. She lifted her head, and I saw her face, pale, with hollow eyes that gleamed in the flashlight's beam. It wasn't a look of anger or malice, but of confusion. Her lips parted, and she spoke, her voice rough and dry. "I'm looking for my campsite," she said, her words slurring. That snapped me out of my trance. I glanced at Matt, who was staring at her with wide eyes. Without saying anything, I motioned for him to follow me. We started walking slowly toward her, trying to keep our distance, but also wanting to help. We didn't know what was going on, but something told me that we needed to help her. She was disoriented, maybe lost. "Are you okay?" Matt asked, his voice trembling slightly. The woman blinked at him, as though she was trying to process the question. Campsite. Where's my campsite? She mumbled again, her voice barely above a whisper. We hesitated. Something still didn't feel right. She stood up then, her movement stiff, as if it took her a moment to get used to standing on two legs again. She was taller than we'd expected, but she wasn't imposing. Her eyes, though, were empty, glazed over like she wasn't really seeing us. After a long, awkward pause, I cleared my throat. We'll help you. Let's get you back to your campsite, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We led her back, walking slowly so she could keep up. The forest was dense, and the way back felt much longer than it had when we were walking in. The whispering had stopped, but the air felt heavy, like something was still watching us. When we finally reached the campground, the woman's friends were still sitting by their fire, laughing and chatting, completely unaware that she had been gone. They barely looked up when we walked her back to them, and she slumped into one of the chairs by the fire, still staring into space. Her friends didn't even seem concerned, just waved us off as they passed her another drink. It was then that I realized how lucky we were. If we hadn't decided to wander further into the woods, if we hadn't heard the whispering and followed it, she could have been lost all night. Hell, she might have wandered deeper into the woods, gotten more lost, or worse. She was just drunk, high, and completely out of it. But in the woods, even a small mistake can lead to something much worse. Matt and I made our way back to our campsite, our steps quick and uneasy. We didn't talk much after that, but neither of us slept well that night. The whole experience lingered with us, hanging in the air like the strange weight of the woods. We never really spoke of it again, but every time I think back on it, I'm reminded of how thin the line is between the safe and the unknown, how easy it is to get lost, not just in the woods, but in the things you can't explain. We went camping every summer when I was a kid. My family had our usual spots, and we bounced between Virginia Beach, Assateague Island, and this go-doffel place called Westmoreland. But Assateague was always my favorite. It had that wild, untouched feeling, especially near the beach, where the sand stretched for miles, and you could hear the waves crashing in the distance. The island had this kind of quiet charm, and the smell of salt water always lingered in the air. We'd set up camp near the dunes, where the wild ponies roamed free and the air was thick with the scent of the ocean. One summer, we decided to camp at Assateague again. It was one of those warm, sticky nights, the kind that left a thin layer of sweat on your skin even after the sun had gone down. The heat of the day was still clinging to the earth, but the night brought a cool breeze off the water. My mom, my dad, and my younger sister had already set up our two tents. One tent was near the edge of the dunes, closer to the beach, and the other was further in, near the trail where the ponies often wandered. I was about 11 at the time, old enough to appreciate the quiet of the island, but still a little scared of the dark. I remember it was the kind of night where the moon hung high and bright in the sky, casting everything in an eerie, pale light. The shadows were long and twisted, and the sound of the waves crashing was both soothing and a little unsettling. I had just settled into my sleeping bag, the air in the tent a little too warm for comfort, when I heard my mom shift in her sleeping bag. It wasn't a noise that woke me, but the sudden stillness that followed. At first, I thought it was nothing, just the usual noises of the night, the distant calls of crickets, the rustling of leaves in the wind. But something felt off. I could tell my mom wasn't asleep anymore. She was sitting up, completely still, not making a sound. I turned over, squinting through the darkness, trying to figure out what had her so alert. My heart skipped a beat when I saw it. In the moonlight, there was a figure standing just outside our tent. At first, it looked like a person, an old woman, hunched over, with long, wiry hair that hung down to her shoulders. Her face was shadowed, but the outline of her body was unmistakable. She was standing at the edge of the tent, her face pressed up against the mesh screen, staring into our tent. The moonlight made everything seem strange and surreal, casting long shadows that twisted in odd directions. I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. The figure was so still, so quiet, like it was watching us, waiting for something. I froze. I didn't know what to say. My chest felt tight, and my breath caught in my throat. I remember feeling this overwhelming sense of dread wash over me, like something was wrong, like something was out of place. I didn't understand what I was looking at, but I knew I was scared. My mind raced, jumping to all sorts of terrible conclusions. Was it a stranger? Was it someone who'd gotten lost in the dark? What was an old woman doing out there in the middle of the night, standing by our tent? I looked over at my mom. She wasn't saying anything, just staring at the figure with this blank, almost frozen expression. She wasn't moving, not even blinking. I could tell she was scared, too. I whispered her name, but she didn't answer. I asked again, my voice a little louder, more urgent, but she still didn't respond. I reached over and touched her arm, shaking her lightly. That's when I saw the figure twitch, just a slight movement, but enough to make me jump. It was like it had heard me. My heart was pounding in my chest now. I couldn't take it anymore. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just lie there, paralyzed by fear. I let out a small noise, half a gasp and half a shout, and immediately the figure jerked away from the tent, its silhouette disappearing into the darkness. I could hear the rustle of leaves and the soft thud of footsteps, quickly fading away into the night. My mind was still racing, my heart still pounding, but it was over. Whatever it was, whatever that figure was, it was gone. But then something strange happened. My mom moved, and I felt her shift beside me, her breathing returning to its normal rhythm. It was as though the tension had left the air all at once. She turned to me, her voice low and steady. "It was just one of the ponies," she said quietly. "They sometimes wander up here." I blinked, trying to make sense of what she was saying. Ponies? The wild ponies that roamed the island? How could that explain what I had just seen? But then I remembered where we were. Our tent had been set up right near the trail where the ponies often passed through. They were wild animals, and they were known to wander up to the campsites, especially if they smelled food or if they were heading down to the beach. It made sense, I guess, in some strange way. But even as she said it, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in my chest. The image of that figure, standing so still, so close to the tent, was burned into my mind. It hadn't looked like one of the ponies, not at first. It had looked like a person, an old woman, staring at us through the mesh of the tent. But as I thought about it more, I realized that the long, wiry hair I had seen could have been the wild hair of a pony, tangled and messy from roaming through the brush. The figure's hunched posture could have been the way a pony moved when it was grazing or standing still. It all started to make sense, but it didn't make the memory any less terrifying. I didn't sleep much after that. Every time I heard the slightest rustle in the night, I would freeze, waiting for the sound of hooves or the brush of fur against the tent. I kept thinking about that figure, that dark silhouette staring in at us, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been watching us. It wasn't until the morning that I started to feel like I could breathe again, the daylight breaking through the trees and dispelling the tension of the night. When I told my dad about it in the morning, he just chuckled. Probably one of those wild ponies. They get curious sometimes. But even as he said it, I could tell he was still a little on edge, too. He'd seen the ponies on the island before, but he had never had one come up to the tent like that. We went out to look around the campsite, and sure enough, we found hoof prints in the sand and in the dirt near the tent. It was clear that the ponies had passed through during the night. Some of them were closer than others, and I could see the marks they had left behind. But even with that explanation, there was still something unsettling about it. The way the figure had moved, the way it had stood there so still, staring at us through the mesh of the tent, felt too deliberate, too intentional. It didn't feel like a random encounter with a curious animal. It felt like something more. Even if it was just one of the ponies, I couldn't get the image of that dark shape out of my mind. We packed up and left that morning, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief as we drove away from the island. As we headed back to the mainland, the memory of that night started to fade, but there was always a part of me that would remember that moment, that feeling of being watched in the dark, and the way the moonlight had made everything seem so much more eerie than it should have been. I never went back to that campsite again. Not because of the ponies, but because I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone had been out there just watching us. The memory of that figure, standing so still and silent, would stay with me, for a long time. It was one of those moments where you knew, deep down, that you'd never be able to fully explain what happened, but you'd never forget it either. I used to live in a tiny town once. When I say tiny, I mean small, real small. The kind of place where you can walk from one end to the other in less than 5 minutes. Population 200, maybe. I worked remotely from a cabin in the woods just outside town, nestled between trees and the side of a highway. No real neighbors close by. You could drive into town for anything you needed, but most of the time, it was just me and my dog in that little cabin. It wasn't fancy, just a small wooden place, but it had its charm. Quiet, peaceful, or at least that's what I thought when I first got there. Everything felt calm for the first few weeks. I wake up early, have some coffee, work on my laptop, and then take my dog out for walks around property. It was the perfect setup for someone who needed solitude. The town had a small, rural charm, though it had its share of oddities. People were strange in a way that didn't make sense to me. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business, but I still felt like an outsider because I didn't grow up there. Still, it was peaceful, and I got into a routine. One morning, I decided to take my dog on a long walk. The air was crisp, and the leaves were just starting to change. The woods around me were quiet, except for the occasional rustle of the trees and the sounds of my dog sniffing at things. I was lost in my thoughts when I heard it. The sharp, unmistakable sound of 2 gunshots in the distance. They were loud, and I could tell they weren't too far off. I paused, listening. It was hunting season, so it didn't seem too out of place. I figured it was just someone out there shooting, maybe getting ready for deer season. I didn't think much of it. Just another day in a rural area. The next day, or maybe the day after, I was sitting outside, enjoying the late afternoon sun, when a truck pulled up in front of my cabin. I didn't recognize it. Small town like this, you'd usually know every vehicle. I felt a little uneasy right away. A guy got out and walked over. I didn't know him, so I wasn't sure if I should even talk to him. But he smiled and waved, and before I could stop myself, I waved back. He called out to me, asking if I had heard the gunshots. I told him I had, and that it sounded like hunting. He nodded, but his face took on a serious expression, like he was about to tell me something important. It wasn't hunting, he said. That was my neighbor. He's been taking pot shots at my house. There's a land dispute between us. Been going on for years. At first, I just nodded, unsure what to say. But the more I thought about it, the more off it seemed. He said the shots were aimed at his house, but this guy was talking to me as if we were longtime neighbors. The guy lived at least half a kilometer away, and I had never seen him around before. It didn't add up. I couldn't even remember his name. Then things got even stranger. My dog, who usually wasn't very shy, started digging around near the front of the cabin. Nothing serious, just sniffing at the dirt. But this guy seemed to take it personally. He started telling her to stop, his voice getting kind of sharp. He even called her over and tried to pet her, which, honestly, made my dog really uneasy. She wasn't used to people she didn't know. That's when he did something that set off every alarm bell in my head. He reached down, grabbed her by the collar, and tried to flip her onto her back. He was trying to do that dominance thing I'd read about, like the Caesar Milan stuff. For no reason at all. My dog yelped, and I told him to stop immediately. He didn't listen. He was so calm about it, too. Like he didn't realize that what he was doing was scaring her. I pulled her away from him, and he finally stopped, but he just shrugged it off like it was nothing. Then, as if things weren't weird enough already, he asked me if I owned any guns. I said no, I didn't. He nodded, almost approvingly, and said, "You should. You never know who you'll run into around here. I'm a great dog trainer, by the way. If you ever need help, just let me know." I didn't know how to respond. It wasn't just the dog thing that was unsettling me. It was the way he was speaking, like he was trying to get me to trust him, but there was something off about it. But the creepiest part came next. He said, "You should come over and mow my lawn sometime, and make sure to bring your dog with you." He didn't ask. He told me. The way he said it felt wrong, like there was an undertone to it that I couldn't quite place, but it didn't sit right with me. I'm sure he thought it was casual, but it sounded forced, like a demand hidden behind politeness. He left shortly after, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Why would he ask about the gunshots in such an odd way? Why was he so interested in my dog? Why did he want me to come over? And why did he keep saying, bring your dog? I had no intention of going to his house. No way. But I started wondering, what if I had been too curious? What if I'd heard something I wasn't supposed to? What if that wasn't his neighbor shooting at his house, but him shooting someone? The thought lingered, making the whole situation feel worse. The next few days were strange. The guy kept showing up. He'd drive by and wave or pull over to ask why I hadn't come by his house yet. At first, I ignored him, but then he started calling me and texting me, asking the same thing. His persistence was unsettling, and it felt like he was pushing me into something I didn't want to do. I eventually learned more about him. The town store owners gave me some background when I mentioned his name in passing. Apparently, the guy was a mess. He'd lost his wife, his job, and everything he'd once had. People said he was dangerous, especially with nothing left to lose. He had a reputation as being one of the most hated guys in the valley. And now I understood why. I hadn't just met some harmless guy from the area. I had met someone who had snapped, someone who might have been capable of anything. I started sleeping poorly. The cabin was quiet, too quiet. It was isolated, the kind of place where if something happened, no one would hear you. I kept thinking about how easy it would be for someone to sneak up on me from the woods. I had a knife, and I kept a can of bear spray nearby. But I had no guns, and that felt like a huge disadvantage. I couldn't stop thinking about the guy. I couldn't shake the image of him sneaking up on me in the night, maybe with a shotgun. It terrified me. One night it happened. In the middle of the night, my dog started growling. At first, it was low, like she was just getting settled. But then it got louder, sharper. She was standing at the door, staring out into the dark. I listened, straining to hear anything. There was nothing. The woods were silent, but it didn't matter. I felt the dread creeping in, and I knew something was wrong. I grabbed the knife and the bear spray, and I locked myself in the bathroom. There were windows in every room of the cabin, but not in the bathroom. I sat on the floor, clutching the knife, the spray in my other hand, waiting for something, anything to happen. I listened to the silence, my heart pounding. I stayed in that bathroom for what felt like hours. I could hear my dog pacing outside the door, still growling. I was too scared to move, too scared to make a sound. I kept thinking that the guy was out there, waiting, watching. Maybe he'd come for me. Maybe he wouldn't. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep in there. The next morning, I woke up still on the bathroom floor. The house was quiet again. My dog was curled up on her bed, completely relaxed. But I couldn't forget the feeling of dread that had gripped me the night before. I knew I had to leave. It wasn't safe there anymore. The guy kept calling and texting, asking if I was coming over yet, asking why I hadn't responded. I was terrified of him, and I knew I couldn't stay. The next day, I packed up everything I could fit into my van. I didn't even bother telling anyone in town. The small town vibe had its dark side, and I didn't want to stick around long enough to see more of it. I left. I drove without looking back. My dog sat next to me, and we just drove. I didn't know where I was going, but anywhere was better than staying there. The town, the people, the man, I wanted nothing to do with it anymore. I left that place behind and never looked back. It had been our idea for a while to get away from everything, just as siblings. No parents, no noise, no responsibilities. Just the quiet of the woods, the peace of the lake, and the crackle of a campfire. We picked a weekend in late summer, just before school would start back up, when the days were still hot and the nights only just starting to cool off. We packed everything we thought we needed. A big family tent, sleeping bags, folding chairs, a propane stove, and coolers loaded with hot dogs, drinks, and snacks. The campground wasn't far from where we grew up, maybe a little over an hour's drive. It was tucked along the edge of a good-sized lake. Not huge, but big enough that you could see the far shore only faintly through the haze of the afternoon sun. We arrived in the late morning, found our reserved spot under a canopy of old pines, and started setting up. The tent went up without too much arguing, and we staked it down well, thinking it might rain a little overnight. Nothing too serious, though. The forecast had said a chance of thunderstorms in the area, but around here that usually just meant some lightning off in the distance and a quick burst of rain. By the time dinner rolled around, The sky had taken on that deep orange glow that only comes after a long day in the heat. We grilled up some hot dogs, talked about stupid stuff from when we were kids, and watched as the sun slowly dipped below the trees on the other side of the lake. A few other families were camping nearby, some with kids still laughing and running around, others already tucked into their tents. The lake had gone still, smooth like glass, only broken by the occasional fish jumping or a breeze curling across it. We were in our tent by about 10, just lying around, reading or messing with our phones. The sound of crickets and the occasional owl were all we could hear. I remember feeling calm, like this was exactly what I needed. Nothing felt wrong, not yet, but a little after midnight, I woke up to something different. It was the wind, not just a breeze, not just a rustling of leaves. This was a deep, constant sound, almost like the distant roar of a freight train. At first, I wasn't even sure I was awake. I sat up, and the walls of the tent were moving slightly, not enough to panic yet, but enough to make me pay attention. I unzipped the door and peeked out. The trees were moving more than they should have been. The lake, which we couldn't really see, was making loud, slapping sounds as waves hit the rocks. Lightning flashed somewhere in the distance, and for a moment, I could see all the way across the lake, dark clouds piling up high into the sky like mountains. I laid back down and tried to ignore it. Storms pass. I'd been through plenty of them. The rain started gently at first, and the sound of it on the tent was actually kind of nice. But then the lightning came again, closer this time. Not just a flash. This was the kind that turned the tent white for a second, and then darkness again, followed by a crack that rattled through my chest. Then just didn't stop. The lightning was nonstop, tearing across the sky in crooked white lines, some coming straight down into the lake, exploding with a sound like a cannon. The thunder wasn't coming in bursts anymore. It was just an endless, rolling growl that never faded. It just layered on itself, louder and louder, with each new strike. I could feel the pressure shift, like the air itself was getting heavier. The walls of the tent began to suck inward and push outward with the gusts. The rain wasn't just falling now, it was slamming down in sheets. The kind of rain you can feel in your bones, drumming against the nylon above us, sounding like it would tear through any second. We all got up without needing to say anything. You didn't need words in that moment. You just knew. We grabbed flashlights, some of us already had shoes on, others were scrambling. The tent felt like it was being peeled off the ground. You could hear the fabric pulling against the stakes, some of them snapping free. The wind catching the edges and lifting it like a balloon ready to take off. I remember one of my brothers holding onto a corner, trying to keep it down, but he gave up when a gust nearly knocked him off his feet. We bolted for the car. The rain was blinding, cold and sharp like needles. The ground was turning to mush under our feet. I slipped once, caught myself on a root or something, tore the skin on my palm. Didn't matter. We got to the car, flung the doors open, and climbed in. We were soaked, every one of us. Water was dripping off our faces, our clothes clinging to our skin, our shoes squishing. The windows fogged up in seconds. I turned the key and the car started. The sound of the engine was barely audible over the roar outside. The car was shaking, not just a little from the wind, but enough that it felt like someone was rocking it from side to side. The trees were bending hard, the kind of bending that doesn't look natural. We watched, helpless, as our tent, our home for the night, snapped in half. The poles gave out, the fabric folded in, and then like something from a movie, it lifted and flew sideways, bouncing once and then slamming into a tree. One of the chairs followed. The cooler tumbled like a toy. That was when we decided we weren't going to wait out. We needed to go. We backed out of the spot, headlights barely cutting through the sheets of rain. The campground road was narrow and twisting. Branches were starting to fall. One tree had already come down near the bathrooms, forcing us to detour through another loop. It was pitch black, except for the lightning. That lightning lit up the whole world every few seconds, so bright it hurt your eyes. It took us about 20 minutes to get to our grandpa's place, but it felt like an hour. Every gust of wind pushed the car slightly. Every flash of lightning made it clear just how insane the storm was. Debris flew across the road, leaves and branches smacking against the windshield. None of us said a word. We were so tired and focused. Just keep the wheels on the road. Don't stop. When we finally pulled into his driveway, the power was out. Everything was dark. We left the car and ran inside using our phone flashlights. He met us at the door, surprised but understanding once he saw our condition. We laid out towels, stripped off wet clothes, and tried to warm up. I remember lying on the couch with a blanket and just shaking, not from cold, but from leftover adrenaline. We didn't sleep much. The next morning, the sun came up like nothing had happened. The air smelled fresh, washed clean by the storm. We ate some cereal, drank some weak coffee, and drove back to the campground. Parts of it were closed off. Park rangers had blocked certain loops. A few big trees were down, blocking the road or lying across campsites. One tree had landed on a picnic table, crushing it flat. Another had come down near the edge of the lake, its roots torn up in a giant tangle. We found our site, or what was left of it. The tent was still in the tree, half wrapped around the trunk, torn in a few places. Our sleeping bags were scattered. One was wedged under a log, soaked through and covered in mud. Mine wasn't there. We looked for it, checked the bushes, the surrounding sites, even asked the camp hosts if they picked up anything. Nothing. It was just gone. Probably flown out into the woods or the lake, maybe snagged on a branch or sunk beneath the surface. We packed up what was salvageable. A few of the steaks, some food in sealed containers, a couple of wet chairs. Everything else was trashed. We didn't talk much. Just went through the motions, packed up, and left. I've camped a lot in my life, seen a lot of weather, but I've never experienced anything like that storm. The sound, the pressure, the power of it. It felt like the world was cracking open. And knowing that a small tornado actually passed through that campground, that just confirmed what we already felt. We were right there, maybe just yards away from something that could have easily taken more than just our gear. Since then, I always double-check the weather before I go out. I don't trust forecasts anymore, not completely. And I've never found that sleeping bag. I don't really care about the bag itself, but sometimes I think about where it ended up, and it reminds me of how fast things can change out there. How close we came to something worse. We got lucky. That's the truth of it. We were lucky to have the car close. Lucky that the tree didn't come down on our tent. Lucky we had somewhere to go. Some people don't get that lucky. I think about that whenever I'm out in the woods and the sky starts to darken. The storm comes fast, and when it does, you better be ready to move. I still camp, still sleep under the stars. But that night is always in the back of my head, whispering a little warning when the wind starts to pick up and the clouds roll in. I've grown up in a rural town surrounded by mountains and forests, so camping was never a rare event for me. It was more like a weekly ritual, something that felt as natural as breathing. Most of the time, I was out there with a group of other kids, ranging from 16 to 19 years old. Sometimes it was a big group, other times just a couple of us looking for a good spot to spend the night. We usually camped in the warmer months, but even in winter, when the cold bit harder than usual, we didn't hesitate to grab our gear and head into the woods. The mountains and forests felt like home. The one time I can't seem to shake, though, happened during one of those winter camping trips. It was just me and my friend Kyle that time. We had decided to break off from the rest of the group to camp at a better fishing spot about a mile or so away from where everyone else was. The others weren't particularly into fishing like we were, so they stayed behind, set up their camp, and probably started drinking by the fire. But me and Kyle, we always liked the solitude. We liked being near the water, the quietness that only the forest in the middle of nowhere could provide. We hiked through the snow, which wasn't too deep at that time of year, and found a nice clearing by the creek. It wasn't an official campsite, but it was perfect for our small group. There was a large boulder in the middle of the clearing, so we decided to set up a lean-to against it instead of a proper tent. It wasn't the most secure structure, but we made it work with what we had. The fire was the first thing we set up. We didn't have a ton of gear between us, just some basic camping equipment and a sleeping bag to share. The logs were crackling nicely, and as I sat there, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. The kind of calm you only get when you're far away from the distractions of life, when it's just you and the wilderness. But that night, that sense of peace quickly turned into something else. I couldn't sleep. The feeling crept up on me like an itch I couldn't scratch. Something wasn't right, but I couldn't pinpoint it. It was the kind of feeling that made your skin crawl, like you were being watched. Maybe it was my imagination. Maybe it was the way the trees rustled in the wind. Or maybe it was just the sheer isolation of it all. I had dealt with this feeling before, mostly with mountain lions. Mountain lions didn't scare me. I had spent plenty of time in the woods, and I knew how to handle them. I had been stalked by a couple of them before, and I knew their behavior. They weren't aggressive unless provoked. You just needed to make yourself look bigger, make a loud noise, and slowly back away. If they were nearby, you'd hear them move, their footsteps faint but there, and their eyes glowing in the darkness if you caught them in your flashlight beam. But this didn't feel like a mountain lion. It was different. It wasn't just the noise of the trees. It wasn't the quiet stillness of the night. It was like there was something or someone out there in the dark watching me. I kept the fire going, throwing more logs on the flames to keep it bright. It wasn't cold, but the fire made the whole clearing feel safer, warmer. Kyle, who had been laying back on the ground, asked me if I was okay. I told him I was fine, just paranoid, probably a little jumpy from the woods. He just grunted and rolled over, falling asleep almost instantly. But I couldn't shake the feeling. I kept my eyes on the shadows around the clearing, tried to convince myself it was just the trees moving. But the longer I stared, the more I felt it. I couldn't explain it, but there was something in the air. The trees seemed to stretch their branches a little farther, the wind a little colder. And then I saw him. He wasn't in the trees. He wasn't hiding in the shadows. He was just standing there at the edge of the clearing, about 80 yards away, watching me. I don't know why I didn't call out, why I didn't say something to Kyle or wave to him. Maybe it was because I was frozen, unsure of what to do. Maybe I thought if I just didn't move, he wouldn't notice me. The light from the fire illuminated the area in front of me, but everything else beyond the fire seemed to melt into the night. Still, there he was, standing in the moonlight under the trees. He wasn't moving, just standing there like he was studying me, like he was waiting for something. I tried to tell myself he wasn't a threat. He could have been just another camper, someone out for a walk in the woods, but something about the way he stood there made me feel uneasy. His clothes were dark, blending into the night, and I couldn't make out his face. It wasn't like I could see details anyway, just the outline of a man standing there. He was tall, but not ridiculously so. Thin, but not like he was malnourished. He was just there. I kept my eyes locked on him. My heart was racing, but my body wouldn't move. I didn't want to break eye contact. It felt like if I did, something would happen. The silence between us was suffocating. After what felt like an eternity, maybe only a couple of minutes, he finally turned and walked away. Slowly at first, then faster, like he wanted to get out of the clearing without alerting me. The light from the fire flickered against the shadows as he moved. He didn't say anything, didn't make a sound as he disappeared into the trees. And I just sat there, staring at the spot where he had been, waiting to hear something, anything more. But there was nothing, just the sound of the wind in the trees and the crackling of the fire. I don't know how long I sat there after that. I couldn't move. My body felt like it was stuck in place, frozen in fear. Kyle was still asleep, completely oblivious. The fire was starting to die down, but I didn't dare let it go out. I threw a few more logs on, just enough to keep the flames strong, but I couldn't take my eyes off the trees. Eventually, the feeling of being watched faded, but I still couldn't sleep. I didn't feel safe, not with what I'd seen. The night dragged on, each minute feeling like an hour. I kept telling myself that maybe it was just someone passing through the area. Maybe it was a hunter or some guy out for a midnight walk. Nothing to worry about. But something in me didn't believe that. Something told me that wasn't the case. The next morning, we packed up quickly and left. I didn't tell Kyle about what I'd seen. I didn't want to freak him out, especially when I wasn't sure what it all meant. It wasn't like anything had happened. The guy didn't approach us. He didn't threaten us. But the memory of him standing there, watching us, stayed with me. Looking back, I can't say for sure who that man was or what he was doing in the woods that night. Maybe he had no ill intentions. Maybe he was just passing through, just as curious about us as we were about him. But I've been out in those woods enough to know when something doesn't feel right. And that night, I can't shake the feeling that whatever was out there watching us was not something I wanted to mess with. It was the last time I ever camped out that far from the group. I've been back to those woods since, but I stick to places where I know other people are nearby, where I know I'm not alone. It's not that I'm afraid of mountain lions or even the dark. It's the feeling of being watched that I can't forget, the lingering unease that sticks with you long after you leave. I used to think it was just paranoia, but now I know that sometimes when you're out in the woods, your instincts are the only thing you have to rely on. And that night, they were screaming at me to be aware, to trust my gut. So I don't ignore that feeling anymore. If I ever get the sense that something's watching me again, I'll trust it, and I'll be ready. Because out there, in the silence of the forest, sometimes the things you can't see are the most dangerous of all. I remember the summer I was working on my Wilderness Survival Merit Badge, and the week-long campout was fast approaching. The idea was simple enough: build a shelter, learn how to start a fire without matches, purify water, and do it all out in the wild with no real adult supervision. It was a big deal for me, especially since I was a nervous kid who hated being away from home for long periods. But I had made it this far in Boy Scouts, and I didn't want to back out now. The campout itself was something the troop had done every year. We went up to this old campsite, far away from civilization, with dense woods and hills that seemed like they were carved straight out of a horror movie. The air always felt different there, like it was holding its breath. Maybe that was just me being paranoid, but I wasn't the only one who felt the tension. The other guys in the troop were starting to get a little jittery too, especially as we neared the night we'd have to sleep in the woods by ourselves. There were about 8 of us boys, all in various stages of awkward teenagehood, each dealing with our own anxieties about being out there, far from the safety of the main campsite. Our adult leader was a seasoned scoutmaster, a man who'd been through more camps and survival tests than any of us could dream of, and he was confident we could handle this. The plan was simple. We'd each go a couple of miles away from the base camp and build our own shelters. The idea was to give us an experience that would push us out of our comfort zones, teach us to trust our instincts and rely on each other. But I was already pretty anxious by the time the day of the solo camping came. It wasn't just the idea of being away from everyone, though that was a part of it. No, it was the whole atmosphere of the woods, the deep silence when you're out there, the way the trees seem to close in on you as soon as night falls. The thought that something was out there, just waiting. I don't know how to explain it, but I could feel it in the pit of my stomach, like the woods themselves were alive and watching us. The first part of the night wasn't so bad. I found a spot a little farther from the other boys, close to a stream, which was perfect for making sure I had fresh water nearby. I spent the evening putting together my makeshift shelter. Nothing fancy, just a tarp and a few branches to keep the rain off. It wasn't perfect, but I figured it would do. I managed to get a fire going, thanks to some flint I had with me, and I sat there for a while, staring into the flames and listening to the crackling sound. The forest around me felt almost too quiet. Not the usual kind of quiet, but the kind where you start hearing your own heartbeat too loudly in your ears. After a while, I forced myself to lie down in my shelter. The temperature dropped quickly, and the wind rustled through the leaves overhead, making everything feel colder. I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag, pulling it tight around me, and tried to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come easy. My mind was racing, running through everything from the survival skills we'd learned that day to the things I'd forgotten to pack. Then I thought I heard something, a snap of a twig, then another. My heart jumped. I lay still, straining my ears. It was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or a squirrel. But in the back of my mind, I kept thinking about the stories of people who'd gone missing in forests, stories I'd heard at campfires from older scouts or movies I'd watched. Suddenly, I heard something. A voice. A loud voice. At first, I thought maybe someone was just messing around, but the voice sounded panicked. "No, please. Get away. Stop. Don't." It cut through the silence like a knife. My heart dropped into my stomach. I sat up, instantly alert. The voice came from the direction of the other boys' shelters, a little ways off, but close enough that I could hear every word clearly. I felt a chill run down my spine. Was someone in trouble? Was someone being attacked? My hands began to shake, and I pulled myself out of my shelter, trying to stay as quiet as possible. My breath was shallow, my heart pounding in my chest. I was paralyzed for a second, caught between fear and the instinct to help. "Hey," I whispered, shouted, hoping someone would respond, hoping to wake up the others. "Hey, is everything okay?" But there was no answer, just dead silence. I waited, holding my breath, listening for anything. No rustling, no footsteps, no response. I waited a few more seconds, then called out again, "Hey guys." Still nothing. I didn't know what was going on. My mind was racing, all the worst possibilities running through my head. I grabbed my flashlight, heart still pounding, and started to move toward the other shelters. But then I froze. I realized something. None of the other boys had woken up. The sounds I had heard from the other shelters, the shouts, the cries for help, didn't seem to have disturbed anyone. It didn't make sense. If someone was really in trouble, the others should have heard it, right? But they didn't. They were all still asleep, undisturbed. I felt a cold sweat on the back of my neck. Was it a dream? Had I imagined it? No. I couldn't shake the sound of that voice, the urgency in it. It didn't feel like a nightmare. It felt too real. But what could it be? What was I hearing? I decided to wait, standing there, frozen in place for what felt like hours. But nothing came. No more sounds. No movement. Slowly, my pulse started to calm. I began to rationalize it. It had to have been someone sleep-talking, right? Maybe one of the other boys had been having a nightmare, yelling out in his sleep. That was it, just a bad dream. I convinced myself that was all it was. But I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. It wasn't just a voice. It was everything. The way the night had settled in so quickly, the oppressive silence of the woods, the fact that no one had stirred. I didn't feel safe. After a while, I reluctantly made my way back to my shelter, trying to convince myself that everything was fine, that I was just being paranoid. But sleep didn't come. Not for a long time. It wasn't until the next morning that things started to make sense, in a way that only made everything worse. The boys were waking up, stretching and groaning, just as I had, trying to shake off the cold and the sleep from the long, uncomfortable night. One of them, Tom, was the last to emerge from his shelter. He looked exhausted, his eyes red, like he hadn't slept at all. And when he finally crawled out of his shelter, he looked at me, and I saw it. There was something off in his eyes. It was a look of confusion, like he wasn't entirely sure where he was. Then he shook his head and blinked a few times, like he was waking from a bad dream. I had a weird dream," he muttered, rubbing his eyes. The others shrugged it off, but I couldn't ignore it. I had to know. "Tom, did you yell out last night?" I asked, my voice quieter than I wanted it to be. He looked at me, his face pale, his eyes flickering. "Yell out? No, man. What are you talking about?" I took a deep breath, my mind racing. The voice I'd heard, the fear in it, I thought it had come from his shelter. But I didn't tell him that. I just nodded, trying to keep calm, even though I felt anything but calm. "No, nothing, just never mind," I said and walked away. I don't know why I didn't tell anyone else. I guess part of me was still hoping it was all just a nightmare, some trick of the mind. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened. Something strange, something I couldn't explain. That night, when we all returned to the main camp, things went back to normal. The days blurred together, and eventually I passed the merit badge test and went home. But I never forgot that night, and I never quite understood what happened. The thought that I'd been the only one who heard it, that I'd been the only one awake to hear that voice crying out in the dark, it haunted me. To this day, I still don't know what it was. But sometimes when I'm alone in the woods, I can still hear that voice. It's faint, distant, but it's there. And no matter how hard I try to rationalize it, no matter how many years have passed, I can't shake the feeling that something happened that night. Something I'll never fully understand. I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. It wasn't just any camping trip. It was at Ginny Springs in Florida, a place I'd heard so much about. I had been camping many times before, but this was different. Something about the clear, refreshing waters and the natural beauty of the place seemed like the perfect escape from the busy, stressful routine of life. I was with a group of friends, But as usual, I like to spend some time alone to enjoy the peacefulness of nature. We set up camp near a secluded area, just a little walk away from the main group. The air was humid, heavy with the smell of damp earth and pine trees. The sun was setting, and the sky turned into a mix of purples and oranges. It felt like something out of a postcard. I had made my camp right next to a line of tall trees that stretched up high into the sky, the kind of trees that seemed like they could have been there for centuries. We set up our tents, lit a campfire, and cracked open some beers. As the night wore on, we hung around the fire, talking and laughing. The sounds of crickets and frogs filled the air, with the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind moved through the trees. It was one of those nights where everything felt perfect, everything except for the heat. Florida nights were sticky, and I could feel the sweat trickling down my back, but I didn't mind. I was out there to escape, to unwind. Around midnight, I had gotten tired of the noise from the group, so I decided to crawl into my tent and catch some sleep. The moment I zipped up my tent, the noise of my friends faded away, leaving me with just the sounds of the night. I laid down on the soft, cool sleeping bag, staring up at the canvas ceiling of my tent. The faint light from the campfire outside barely seeped through, casting strange shadows on the inside. I closed my eyes and tried to relax, but the sound of the forest were a little unsettling, even for someone used to the outdoors. It's funny how even the most peaceful places can make you feel small, like you're just a visitor in the world of trees and animals. Then, out of nowhere, I heard it. A loud crash. It wasn't like the usual noises you hear in the woods, the rustle of animals or the creaking of trees. This was different. This sounded like a giant tree falling. It wasn't something you'd expect to hear in the middle of the night, and the sound was so loud it shook the ground beneath me. My heart skipped a beat and I froze. I hadn't heard any wind that strong. The trees around me were still, and the sky had no storm clouds. It was as if the ground had just decided to give way and let something massive fall. I thought it could have been a tree from the woods nearby, but it didn't seem right. It felt too close, too loud. Still, after a moment of hesitation, I convinced myself that it was just a random occurrence. Maybe the storm earlier in the day had weakened a tree, or maybe it was just the wind playing tricks. Florida weather was unpredictable, after all. I tried to shake it off and rolled over, pulling the sleeping bag tighter around me. But then came something else that bothered me. Voices. At first, I didn't think much of it. There were always people around in the camp, so it was normal to hear some chatter every now and then. But these voices, they were different. They weren't the typical sounds of laughter and light conversation you'd expect around a campfire. These voices were closer, frantic, and anxious. I could hear them moving around outside my tent, the sound of feet crunching through the leaves, and the unmistakable shuffle of people pacing. It was late, and I figured maybe someone had gotten drunk and wandered off into the woods, or maybe they were just making noise to keep themselves awake. But then I heard something that made my blood run cold. One of the voices, low and panicked, said something about the tree. I couldn't make out the rest, but that one word stuck with me. My brain was trying to process it, but it just didn't add up. What tree? I sat up, heart racing, unsure if I should stay put or go outside to see what was going on. Curiosity got the better of me, and I slowly unzipped my tent. The air was cooler now, but still thick with humidity. The campfire flickered in the distance, casting long shadows on the forest floor. My friends were gathered around it, but their voices were hushed now, a contrast to the usual noise and laughter. Something felt wrong. I stood up, carefully stepping out of my tent, my feet crunching softly on the forest floor. I walked toward the campfire, my eyes scanning the area, trying to make sense of what was going on. The voices were still there, faint, coming from a little ways away. I glanced around, my senses on high alert. Then I saw it, the tree. It had fallen on one of the tents nearby, completely crushing it. The massive trunk of the tree had slammed down, its roots exposed, splintered with scattered everywhere. There was nothing left of the tent but a shredded mess of fabric and poles. My stomach dropped, and I felt a rush of panic. The people around the fire had gathered, but they weren't talking like they had been earlier. They were all standing in silence, watching something. It was then that I saw a figure, someone in the middle of the group, talking to the others, their face pale, hands shaking. I didn't recognize them, but their expression told me everything. They were in shock. The area around the fallen tree was roped off, and there were other campers standing by, whispering to each other, their eyes wide with fear. A couple of people were kneeling by the crushed tent, but I could tell right away there was nothing they could do. I could feel the tension in the air, like everyone was holding their breath. Then in the distance, I heard the unmistakable sound of a helicopter. The blades cut through the air, and I could see the lights in the sky growing larger as it approached. My heart sank even further. There was no need for a helicopter unless someone was seriously injured, or worse. I stood there, frozen, watching as the chopper circled overhead, its lights flashing, casting an eerie glow over the camp. The sound of the blades was deafening, but it didn't drown out the panic in the air. The campers around me had gone completely still, as if they were all waiting for the worst to happen. As the helicopter hovered over the camp, I could hear the voices of paramedics shouting instructions to each other. The sound of feet scrambling and people running toward the area where the tent had been crushed filled the air. I didn't want to go closer, but something pushed me forward, an urge to see what was happening. I walked toward the group of people kneeling by the fallen tree, my feet moving almost of their own accord. When I reached the clearing, I saw the body. It was barely recognizable, just a crumpled mess of limbs and fabric, half buried beneath the fallen tree. The paramedics were working quickly, but it was clear that the person was beyond help. I had seen enough death to know that much. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, and I took a step back. The air around me seemed to grow colder despite the humidity. People were whispering now, their voices trembling. The sound of the helicopter blades still echoed in my ears as it circled overhead, waiting to lift the body away. I couldn't help but feel like I'd been part of something that shouldn't have happened, that I should have somehow known something was wrong earlier. I should have heard the sound of that tree falling more clearly, or maybe I should have done something sooner. But it was too late now. The helicopter took off shortly after, carrying the body away, leaving nothing behind but the shattered remnants of the tent and the fallen tree. The rest of the night was a blur. We all went back to our tents, too shaken to speak, too stunned to process what had just happened. The sounds of the forest seemed distant now, as if everything had gone quiet in the wake of the tragedy. When the morning came, the forest was as beautiful as it had been the night before. The birds were chirping, the sun was shining through the trees, and everything seemed normal again, as if the events of the night had been a bad dream. But I knew it wasn't a dream. I knew that someone had lost their life, and that no amount of beauty or serenity could change that. I packed up my gear quietly, not wanting to talk, not wanting to think about what had happened. My friends didn't say much either. None of us knew what to say. I didn't stay for the rest of the trip. I left early that morning, the weight of the experience heavy in my chest. It felt wrong to be there anymore. The place that had once seemed like a perfect getaway now felt haunted, as if the air itself carried the memory of what had happened. I drove back home in silence, the road stretching out in front of me, but my mind was far away, thinking about that tree and the person who didn't make it out. I haven't been back to Ginny Springs since then, and maybe I never will. It was the summer of 1984, and my parents had taken off on a long canoe trip in the northern backcountry of Saskatchewan. Back then, there was no GPS, no cell phones, no satellite beacons, just a folded topographic map, a compass, and a lot of experience. They were deep in the wilderness, far away from any road, town, or cabin. Just lakes, trees, rock outcrops, and silence. They'd been planning the trip for months. My dad had always been into paddling and backwoods camping, and he'd done trips like this before, but this one was special. It was remote, really remote. There were no other people, no trails, just miles and miles of lakes and rivers, with the occasional portage path carved out by moose trails in use over time. They paddled for days, weaving through narrow waterways and open lakes. The sun was hot in the day, and mosquitoes came in thick clouds whenever the wind died down. But it was beautiful. Still mornings with mist hovering over the lake. The low call of loons echoing through the trees, fish breaking the surface, and the occasional splash of a beaver slapping its tail before diving under. At night, they'd cook simple meals over the fire: rice, beans, bannock, some jerky, or canned fish. It wasn't gourmet food, but out there it tasted like luxury. They'd pick their campsites with care: flat ground, close to water, but not too close, far enough from animal trails, and usually with a good view of the lake. That night, they'd set up on a narrow rise above a small cove where they had a bit of breeze to keep the bugs down. There was a thick line of brush behind them: willows, birch saplings, and tall grasses. The ground was a mix of pine needles, moss, and roots. They set up the old canvas tent, heavy but reliable, and settled in as the light faded. They were tired. It had been a long day of paddling, and the last portage had been tough, wet, muddy, and longer than expected. They ate a quick meal, cleaned up, and crawled into their sleeping bags not long after the stars came out. No fire that night, just a small lamp and the sound of night settling in. The lake was calm, and even the mosquitoes had mostly quieted down. It was probably sometime after dawn, though still early when it happened. My dad isn't one to sleep in, but he was still half asleep when he heard the noise. A low rustling, like something moving in the bushes just behind the tent. He thought maybe it was wind at first or a squirrel, but it didn't stop. It got louder, branches snapping, heavy steps in the underbrush. It wasn't fast or panic, just steady, heavy movement. He sat up slowly, still wrapped in the sleeping bag, and listened. The noise was close, real close, just behind the tent wall, maybe a foot or two away. Then it paused. Before he could process it, something heavy collapsed the entire side of the tent. He said it felt like a car door falling on top of him. The canvas caved in on his chest, and the tent poles on his side bent inward and dropped. His breath caught in his throat. The weight was real. It wasn't crushing, but it was enough that he couldn't move. Just heavy and sudden. My mom yelled, startled awake, and tried to sit up, but her side of the tent was still standing. Then, as suddenly as it had fallen, the weight lifted. The tent snapped back up partway, sagging now with broken supports, but the pressure was gone. By now, they were both wide awake. My dad rolled out of the sleeping bag and unzipped the tent flap in one fast motion. The air was cool and damp, the lights soft and gray with early morning mist. About 10 feet away, just standing there in the open space between the tent and the tree line, was a black bear. Not huge, but definitely adult, maybe a couple 100 pounds. Its ears were perked up and its head was tilted, like it was trying to figure out what had just happened. It wasn't aggressive, just confused. It stood with one paw half lifted, like it had been walking and suddenly stopped. Its eyes were fixed on the tent. My dad didn't hesitate. He shouted, just loud noise. Not words, just sound. My mom joined in, both of them yelling and clapping and waving their arms from the tent entrance. The bear didn't run right away. It backed up a few steps, looked from side to side, and then turned and loped off into the trees. It wasn't in a hurry, but it was clearly done with them. They listened to the sound of it crashing through the underbrush, getting fainter and fainter. Silence settled again. My dad stepped out of the tent barefoot, still in his long underwear, and looked at the side that had collapsed. The tent pole was bent, and there was a shallow depression in the soft moss where the bear had stumbled. A few tufts of black fur clung to a low branch nearby. It didn't look like the bear had attacked the tent. More like it had come out of the bushes and lost its footing. Maybe it had been foraging or just walking through and didn't realize the tent was there until it was too late. The ground was uneven behind the tent, with a sharp drop and a few hidden rocks beneath the moss. If the bear had stepped wrong, it could have slipped and landed right on the tent wall. They spent the next half hour fixing the tent, checking their gear, and making a lot of noise. My dad found the bear's tracks behind the tent, big, wide prints in the damp moss, leading in from the woods and then away toward the lake. No sign it had circled back. It hadn't touched their food, probably hadn't even smelled it yet. Their food bag had been hung properly, high in a tree off to the side of the campsite, and still untouched. They boiled water for coffee and sat quietly, watching the lake. Neither of them said much. The adrenaline had worn off, but the weirdness of it lingered. Not fear exactly, but something close. A feeling like the wild had brushed right up against them, closer than either of them wanted. It had touched them, almost literally. The line between safe and not safe had been thinner than they thought. They stayed one more night at that campsite, but moved the tent farther from the tree line and built a small fire. Not for warmth or cooking, just to have light. That night, they didn't sleep deeply. Every rustle made them sit up, but nothing came back. The forest stayed quiet, and by the next morning, the bear was just a story. When they got back home weeks later, and someone asked how the trip had gone, my dad said casually that he got sat on by a bear. People laughed, thought he was joking, but it was true. Not attacked, not mauled, just sat on. The story stuck in our family. My parents still tell it from time to time, not as a scary memory, but as one of those strange, real moments that can only happen far away from everything. Out where the wild doesn't care that you've set up your tent just so, where the animals aren't expecting you any more than you're expecting them. Where you're just another part of the landscape, no more important than a boulder or a bush. Just something to trip over. And that's the truth of it. Out there, you can do everything right. You can follow all the rules, take every precaution, and still get a bear bum dropped on you in your sleep. It's not about fear. It's about respect. Knowing that no matter how careful you are, nature doesn't owe you a warning. They kept camping after that. Lots of trips. Bears, moose, wolves, storms. But that moment stuck with them. A black bear, confused and a little embarrassed, 10 feet away from a crushed tent and 2 stunned campers. Sometimes the wild just reminds you who's in charge. I pulled into the valley after a long day on the trail. The sun had started to dip below the ridge, casting long shadows over the narrow road. The valley felt quiet, almost too quiet, like the kind of place you go to get away from it all. No cell service, no distractions, just the sound of the wind and the rustling leaves. I didn't mind the solitude. In fact, I loved it. It was the kind of peace I came out here for, away from everything. But this time, something felt different. I had stayed on the trail later than I planned. It was getting dark by the time I reached the end of my hike. That's when I ran into the guy. I passed a couple of cabins, but none looked occupied. The trail had been deserted, and I hadn't seen anyone for miles. Then, out of nowhere, this guy appeared. He seemed harmless enough, just a local out for a walk. He waved as I passed, and we exchanged some small talk about the area. He told me he knew a good camping spot nearby. Nice little hideaway right by the river, he said, not far from the road, but camouflaged. I thought about it for a moment, then agreed to follow him. We didn't talk much as we walked. The guy was friendly, but kept to himself mostly, and it was getting darker with each step. When we reached the spot, he pointed out the little clearing by the river, tucked behind some trees. It was a good spot, out of sight, but close enough to the road in case something went wrong. Perfect, I thought. I thanked the guy, and he just nodded before walking off, disappearing back into the trees. I set up my camp there, feeling a little off, but not enough to worry. I had everything I needed: firewood, my gear, and my cooler. I set up a fire and cracked open a beer. I pulled out my earbuds and started listening to one of my friend's comedy podcasts. The sound of laughter and crackling fire filled the air. I was loud. I didn't care. The night was getting darker, and I was in a remote spot. Who was going to hear me? The fire gave off a warm glow, and I started to relax. The beer helped. It wasn't long before I finished it and cracked another one. The night felt calm. The trees swayed in the breeze, and I could hear the river murmuring not far off. It was getting late, and I was feeling lazy. The thought of setting up my tent seemed unnecessary. The back of my truck had a topper, and my gear was all stored in there. It felt more comfortable to sleep under the topper with all my stuff around me. So I just crawled into the back of the truck, pulled my sleeping bag out, and called it a night. I woke up to the soft light of morning. The fire had gone out overnight, and the valley was quiet again, except for the river, which seemed to never stop. I rubbed my eyes and crawled out of the truck. The morning was cool, and the sun was still low in the sky, but it was bright enough that I could see the camp clearly. I stretched, cracked open a beer, and started making breakfast, just a simple oatmeal and some eggs. I was getting everything ready when I saw him. At first, I thought I was imagining it. A figure standing at the edge of my camp. A man, He wasn't close to the fire or the food. He was just standing there, a little outside the circle of light that the fire had left behind. My stomach dropped. It was like he just appeared out of nowhere. He was tall, with a long, scraggly beard, and his clothes were a mess, dirty, torn up, and covered in plastic grocery bags. The bags were tied all over him, dangling like some kind of makeshift armor. It didn't make sense. What kind of person did that? I felt a tightness in my chest. I stood there frozen for a second, unsure of what to do. He wasn't looking at me. In fact, he wasn't looking at anything in particular. His gaze was just vacant. He seemed unaware of me, or maybe he didn't care. I watched as he paced around the edge of my camp. Not in a hurry, just walking slowly like he was lost in his own world. "Nice day," I said, trying to break the silence. No response. I tried again, a little louder. "Beautiful morning." Nothing. I clear my throat. "I've got some breakfast cooking, if you're hungry." Still no response. He didn't even turn to face me. He just kept pacing, his movements slow and deliberate, like he was inspecting the perimeter of my camp. My mind started racing. Why wasn't he acknowledging me? What the hell was going on? I felt my hands tense up. I had my bear spray right next to me. I've been keeping it close since I got here. There were bears in the area, after all. And the knife. My buck knife was right beside me, too. I wasn't sure what was going on, but I wasn't about to let this guy get too close. "Hey," I said, a little more forcefully this time. "Are you going to say something? Or are you just going to stand there?" The guy ignored me again. That's when I really started to get uncomfortable. He was just standing there, his back turned to me as if I wasn't even there. But I knew something was wrong. I wasn't sure what, but I could feel it in my gut. I stood up from the fire and slowly reached for the bear spray. I took a few steps forward, keeping my eyes on him. "You need to leave, man. Right now." My voice was firm, even though my heart was racing. The guy didn't budge. I took another step forward. I had no idea what he was doing, but it was obvious that he wasn't going to leave. He wasn't even looking at me, like I didn't even exist to him. That's when I finally snapped. "Motherfucker, you're either going to acknowledge me or leave immediately." I shouted. He didn't react, not even a flinch. That was it. I grabbed the bear spray, pointed it in his direction, and walked a few more steps towards him. "Leave now," I said, my voice shaking. Finally, he turned, not towards me, but just turned around slowly, as if it was some kind of slow-motion decision he was making. He walked away without a word, moving through the trees, his ragged clothes swishing in the wind. I didn't stick around to watch him go. I grabbed my stuff, threw it all into the truck, and slammed the tailgate shut. My hands were shaking. I didn't even bother with the fire, just jumped in the truck and drove off, not looking back. The whole time I was driving away, I kept thinking about the night before. Had he been watching me while I slept? How long had he been there? Had he been waiting for me to let my guard down, to fall asleep in my truck? I couldn't shake the feeling that he had been there the whole time. I didn't go back to that spot. I didn't go near that valley again. Something about that man, about the way he moved, his eerie disregard for my presence, fell off. I wondered how many times he'd done that before. Just appeared out of nowhere, wandered around campsites without saying a word. That's when I realized how lucky I had been. If I had set up my tent like I had planned, I might not have had the chance to confront him. I might have woken up to something much worse. My decision to sleep in the truck, lazy as it was, had saved me. I never went back to that valley. Not because I was scared, but because I knew there were things out there in the wild that you can't control. People you can't explain. I had learned that the hard way. I still think about it sometimes, the guy with the grocery bags. And I'm glad I got out of there when I did. I've been needing some time alone, the kind where there's no phone reception, no cars, no people talking nearby. Just quiet, just space. I picked a patch of bushland a few hours drive out from the city. It wasn't a campground, not really. It was crown land, I think, or maybe just old farmland someone had forgotten about. I found a spot by accident a few years earlier, just scouting around with my old Hilux and noting places where it felt good to breathe. I remembered a flat stretch with thick trees and a dry creek bed, and enough of a clearing for a tent. No signs, no fences, nothing to suggest anyone went there often. It felt right. Isolated. Peaceful. I arrived in the late afternoon. The sun had just started its slow sink, casting that golden haze across the grass and trunks. The place smelled dry, like eucalyptus leaves and sunbaked dirt. The air had that stillness to it that only happens when you're a long way from anyone else. No power lines buzzing, no distant hum of a highway, just cicadas and the occasional crack of a branch in the breeze. I parked the Uda off a bit, near some scrub, so it wasn't visible from any track that might be nearby. I didn't want company. I grabbed my pack, water, tent, and gear, and walked about 20 minutes deeper in until I found the clearing I remembered. It was just as I'd left it. More leaf litter on the ground, a bit more growth around the edges, but still familiar. Ground was dry and crunchy underfoot, every step crackling with broken twigs and dead leaves. You could hear anything moving out here. I pitched the tent with my back to a thick patch of tea trees, figuring that would block wind. Took my time setting up, laid out my foam mat, sleeping bag, bit of gear in the corner. I had my little butane stove, a lantern, and knife clipped to my belt. Standard stuff. Nothing fancy. As it got darker, the bush started making its usual sounds. Frogs in the distance, insects buzzing, the occasional scurry of something small through the undergrowth. I had a quick boil up, ate a tin of beans with a spoon straight from the can, then sat outside the tent with my torch off for a while, just watching the bush darken around me. Stars started poking through above the tree canopy. It was peaceful in that way only real bush solitude can be. I liked it. I felt grounded. By around 9 or 10, it was pitch black except for the glow of the moon behind some clouds. I crawled in my tent, zipped it up, and lay back listening. It takes a while to sleep in the bush when you're alone. Every sound stands out, branches shifting, possums thumping, the wind moving leaves just enough to sound like footfalls. But after a while, it all becomes background noise. I drifted off. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. My watch was buried somewhere in my pack, and I wasn't keen to fumble around for it. What woke me wasn't a noise, exactly. Not like a bang or footsteps or voices. It was a plop, like something falling straight down onto the ground. Not a thud, not a scuffle, just a single soft, wet plop. I lay there for a few seconds, ears straining. Nothing else. No crackling of leaves. No breeze. Dead still. I thought maybe a branch had dropped, maybe a bit of fruit from a tree, though I couldn't remember seeing any fruit trees nearby. I turned onto my side, listening. Still nothing. The quiet started to feel heavy, like the bush was holding its breath. I didn't unzip the tent. I don't know why. I guess something about the sound felt out of place, but I told myself it was nothing. Probably just a possum knocking something over or some piece of bark falling. Bush noises can get weird at night. I lay awake for a while longer, trying not to focus on how quiet it had gotten. Even the insects seemed to have gone silent. Eventually, I fell back asleep. Must have been sometime before dawn. When I woke up again, the sky was starting to brighten. Pale gray-blue light, enough to make out shapes through the fabric of the tent. Birds had started up again, magpies warbling, the odd cockatoo screech in the distance. I stretched, unzipped the tent, and pushed the flap open, and froze. Right there, no more than 2 feet from where my boots were placed outside the flap, was a kangaroo's head. It was fresh, still glossy, dark eyes. Blood pooled out beneath it into the dry leaves, soaking them deep red. The neck was rough, ripped not clean. Jagged sinew, dirt caught in the fur around the edge. Flies were already starting to gather. The smell hit me half a second later, metallic and sour. I stared at it for a long time, not moving, not breathing, just trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There had been nothing there last night. I'd cleared the ground myself, brushing back the sticks and leaves so I wouldn't rip the tent floor. There's no way I could have missed it. And the tent door had been zipped shut the whole time. I looked around, slowly. Trees, bushes, the same as yesterday. Nothing seemed disturbed. No drag marks, no blood trail. Just this single kangaroo head, sitting upright like it had been placed there. I got out of the tent, careful not to touch it. The ground was dry, the leaves still scattered. I walked a slow circle around the clearing. No prints I could see, no sign of anything big coming through. But I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. It wasn't just creepy, it was wrong. There's no way a predator dropped that there. No animal around here kills a kangaroo and just leaves the head at a campsite without making a mess. A wild dog would have torn it up. A pig might have had to go, but not like this. No blood trail, no bones, no body. Just a cleanly dropped head. It wasn't right. I packed up in a blur. I didn't eat, didn't make coffee. Just shoved everything into my pack, ripped down the tent half folded, threw it into the tray of the Hilux, and started driving. I didn't stop until I was well past the tree line where I could see paddocks again and farmhouses in the distance. Even then, I didn't breathe properly until I hit the bitumen road. I didn't even want to look in the rearview mirror. When I got home, I unpacked everything in the backyard. I checked the tent for blood, checked my gear. Nothing. No signs of anything out of place, except the memory of it. That sound, that plop in the night, and the way the bush had gone silent after. I didn't report it. What was I going to say? There was no one to report it to. No laws broken. No damage done, except my nerves. I haven't camped alone since. I still go out, sometimes, still walk in the bush, but I bring someone with me. And I don't go back to that patch of land. Not even close. Some things don't need explaining. Some things are better left alone. I don't know who or what left that kangaroo head there, but I know it wasn't there when I went to sleep. I know no animal did it. I know it was placed, and that whoever did it came close enough to my tent to drop it right outside. And I know, beyond any doubt, that I wasn't alone out there. Not that night. Not after I heard that sound. I wasn't alone. The night my wife and I camped in that forest will always stay with me. It was supposed to be a simple, quiet getaway. Just the two of us in the middle of nowhere. We both love nature, the silence, the stillness, but that night was different. We'd found a secluded spot off a trail we had hiked a few times before. The forest was dense with jack pine, their twisted branches and needles, making it feel almost like a cathedral. Everything about it had felt right when we first arrived. We set up camp, pitched our tent, and made a small fire. There was a calm breeze, and the sky was a perfect shade of fading orange as the sun dipped behind the trees. We were laughing, talking about our plans for the weekend, enjoying the simple things. The crackling fire, the smell of the pine, the crisp air. We didn't even notice the shift at first. The way the wind had started to pick up, the faint rustling in the trees that seemed to grow louder. Then it happened. The wind turned from a gentle breeze to a violent gust. Suddenly, it felt like the trees themselves were angry, shaking violently as if the earth beneath them was trembling. I watched in disbelief as one of the towering jack pines, its base as thick as a man's waist, started to sway. The wind screamed through the branches, and before I could even react, the tree cracked, splintering in a way that echoed across the forest, and it crashed to the ground with a deafening roar. My wife and I froze, eyes wide in shock. The fire flickered, and we heard a loud snap from another direction. A branch, larger than any I'd ever seen before, tore free from its trunk and came tumbling down, crashing right into the area where our tent had been just moments earlier. The force of the gusts seemed to push the trees to their limits, making the whole forest feel alive, restless, dangerous. We barely had time to react. I grabbed my wife's hand and pulled her toward the tree line, trying to find any shelter we could. As we ran, I saw more trees beginning to fall. The wind screamed louder, the sound filling the air like the roar of an untamed beast. "Get down," I shouted, pulling her behind a large rock for cover. We crouched there, huddled close, hearts pounding in our chests. The sound of the wind was overwhelming, and I could barely hear anything else above it. It felt like the forest itself was coming apart at the seams. The gust didn't stop. It felt like hours, though it couldn't have been more than 30 minutes. We sat there, shivering, terrified, as trees crashed down around us, their roots exposed to the air like broken fingers. It wasn't just the wind anymore. It was everything around us being torn apart. I could feel the tremors in the ground, as if the earth itself was shaking in terror. When it finally slowed, when the trees stopped falling and the wind settled, it left an eerie, oppressive silence in its wake. The forest, so alive before, was now still and unnatural. The fire had gone out, the ashes cold and dark. I looked around, feeling the weight of something watching us, though I couldn't say what. The air was thick with tension. It wasn't just the storm. It was the weight of the unknown that seemed to press down on me. My wife's grip tightened in mine, and I realized we weren't alone in the forest anymore. Something was out there, something beyond the wind, beyond the falling trees. The next morning, we packed up as quickly as we could. The forest was still too quiet. It was almost as if nature itself had recoiled from the night before. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of our footsteps on the forest floor. We never talked about it much after we left. I don't think either of us had words for it. But that wasn't the creepiest experience I've had camping. That would be the time I went camping with my best friend. We had a tradition of getting away to these semi-remote camping spots, places that weren't too far out of reach, but required a bit of effort to get to. Usually we'd use my truck, a 4x4, but you could only access these spots if you knew what you were doing. This one, though, was on the edge of being too far out. The area was semi-maintained, maybe a fire pit or two, a couple of rundown picnic tables, and a shack that barely passed for an outhouse. We figured we'd stay a few days, hike, fish, and just take it easy. When we arrived, it was already starting to get late, but we had enough light to set up camp. As usual, we didn't take the usual safe spots. We picked a little offbeat area near a stream where we could sit back and enjoy the view without anyone else around. I started unloading gear while my friend wandered off to the outhouse. I didn't think much of it at the time. He had always liked to check out the old facilities, poking fun at how bad they were. But then he came back, looking pale. "You gotta go check the first outhouse," he said, his voice strange. I wasn't sure if he was messing with me, but I grabbed a flashlight and headed over there. The door creaked as I opened it, and I immediately saw what he meant. Inside the outhouse, there were 3 backpacks. Not just any backpacks. These were big, full-size packs, the kind you'd use for a week-long trek into the backcountry. They were shoved in the corner of the shack, and there was no sign of anyone else around. I was curious, so I popped open the first one. The gear inside was top-notch: sleeping bags, tent stakes, a high-quality stove. Nothing too unusual, just good camping gear. The second pack was similar, filled with more gear, all in perfect condition. But when I opened the third one, I was thrown off. This bag was stuffed to the brim with Skittles. Not just 1 or 2 bags, but dozens, every type of Skittles you could imagine. Regular, tropical, sour, and even some that I didn't recognize. Bulk bags, small bags, all mixed together in a heap of candy. It made no sense. I couldn't figure out why someone would leave behind all that gear, or worse, why they'd have packed an entire backpack full of candy. It was disturbing, and the more I thought about it, the more uneasy I became. We didn't stay in that area long, but when we left, the bags were still there. We didn't touch anything else, just packed up our camp and drove out. Before we left civilization, we let the local authorities know about what we'd found. The whole thing was just too weird to ignore. Who had left all that gear? Why would anyone carry around that much candy? The answers never came, and to this day, I still don't know what happened to those bags or why they were left there. It just doesn't make sense. Another time, it wasn't a strange campsite, but it was something that made me question the safety of the wilderness. I had taken my dog on a spur-of-the-moment backpacking trip. It wasn't far off the road, just a quick overnight thing to get away. I set up a small shelter with my tarp and built a fire, making sure to stay low and not draw too much attention. I was just starting to doze off when I heard the sound of a truck engine in the distance. The truck got closer, and then I heard the voices. They were loud, slurred, the unmistakable sound of drunk men. The truck pulled up near the clearing, and I could hear the sound of bottles clinking together. My dog growled softly beside me, sensing the tension. Then came the sound of gunfire. It was random at first, just popping sound in the distance. But then it came closer. The shots were erratic, uncoordinated, and I could hear the bullets whizzing through the air, too close for comfort. I had no idea how many there were, but I could tell they weren't aiming at anything in particular. They were just firing blindly into the dark. I stayed low, hoping they didn't see me. But the shots were getting closer, and I realized I was probably within their line of fire. I wasn't sure how much longer I could stay hidden. My heart raced as I grabbed my dog and whispered for him to stay quiet. I could hear them laughing, their voices growing louder as they stumbled around, firing their guns into the night. I didn't wait any longer. I grabbed my stuff, put the leash on my dog, and started walking quickly toward the road. I didn't look back, didn't make a sound. I just kept moving until I was far enough away that I didn't hear their voices anymore. It was one of the most terrifying things I've ever experienced. The feeling that a group of drunk idiots could be shooting in your direction without a care in the world. It's enough to make you realize how quickly things can go wrong in the wilderness. When I got back to the road and finally got some distance, I felt a sense of relief. But it didn't really go away. I didn't feel safe again until I was back in civilization. And even then, I couldn't shake the image of those drunken men stumbling through the night with their guns, unaware or uncaring of what they were doing. Camping is supposed to be peaceful, a way to get away from everything and recharge. But it's in those moments, those strange and terrifying experiences, that you realize just how unpredictable and dangerous the wild can be. We had been planning this camping trip for weeks. A group of 6 friends, all of us excited to escape the noise and chaos of the city for a weekend in the middle of nowhere, Arizona. We had rented a couple of trucks, packed up the coolers, and headed out to a spot in the desert that, from the map, seemed remote enough to give us the peace and quiet we were all craving. The idea was simple. Camp under the stars, drink beer, tell stories, and forget about the world for a couple of days. Little did we know, we were about to find ourselves face to face with something far more sinister than any of us expected. It was the second night of our trip when everything went wrong. We had set up camp near a small ravine, a place that seemed perfect, secluded, quiet, and far from any kind of civilization. The sky was clear, the air was crisp, and the fire was crackling with that comforting sound that always makes you feel at home in the wild. We were having a good time, telling ghost stories, laughing, and even playing a few rounds of cards by the firelight. But as the night wore on and the temperature dropped, we decided to call a night and head into our tents. I remember lying in my sleeping bag, the cool air creeping into the tent as I tried to fall asleep. My mind was racing with the kind of thoughts that come when you're out in the wild, alone with your friends, far from any help if something went wrong. But eventually, my exhaustion took over, and I drifted off to sleep, hoping that the silence of the desert would be the last thing I'd remember before falling into a peaceful slumber. It wasn't long before I woke up again, but this time, it wasn't the usual sound of the wind or the night creatures that did it. No, it was something far more unnerving. I could hear the unmistakable sound of sniffing, soft and deliberate, right outside our tent. At first, I tried to brush it off, thinking it was just an animal, maybe a deer or some other creature that had wandered into our campsite. But as the sniffing continued, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The noise wasn't the kind of sniffing an animal makes when it's just curious about the scent of food. This was different, like something was trying to smell us, specifically as if it was trying to figure out who or what was inside. I froze, holding my breath, trying to listen for any other signs of movement. The sniffing seemed to move around the perimeter of our tent, slow and steady, as if whatever it was circling us. My immediate thought was that maybe one of my dumbass friends hadn't tied up the trash properly. That was the only explanation I could come up with. We had left some food out earlier, and I had joked about how easy it would be for a bear to stumble upon it. But this felt different. Then, just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, I heard the sniffing move away from our tent and travel to the next one, the one where our other friends were sleeping. My heart started pounding in my chest. I wasn't the only one who had heard it. I could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating, as all of us in my tent lay perfectly still, barely breathing. Without a word, we all reached out to grab one another's arms or shoulders, the silent acknowledgement that we were all awake and aware of what was happening outside. For a few seconds, everything was silent. The sniffing had stopped, but I could hear the soft shuffle of footsteps moving cautiously around our campsite. I didn't know what to do. Should we make noise? Should we just lie still and hope whatever it was would leave? My mind raced through the possibilities, but before I could decide on anything, the The silence was shattered by a loud scream from the other side of the camp. One of my friends, Adam, who had been sleeping in the tent closest to the source of the sniffing, had jumped up and burst out of his tent. "Get away from my shit," he yelled, his voice filled with a mix of fear and anger. I could hear the sound of something clattering around as he fumbled with his gun. He had brought a pistol for protection, just in case. I didn't know if he had planned on using it, but his outburst was enough to scare whatever it was away. The sniffing stopped, and the footsteps quickly retreated. But just as I thought it was over, the worst possible thing happened. Through the thin walls of the tent, I could hear the unmistakable sound of someone rummaging through our coolers. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't a bear or a coyote. It was a person. A man had somehow managed to sneak up on us, go through our food, and even decide that sniffing our tents was an acceptable thing to do. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. We were not alone out here. Adam, still in a state of panic, began shouting, "Who the hell are you? What do you want?" His voice echoed through the night, but it didn't sound like it was making any difference. Whoever this person was, they weren't afraid of us. In fact, it almost seemed like they were enjoying this twisted game of cat and mouse. Suddenly, the figure appeared in the light from our campfire. He was tall, dressed in ragged clothes, with long, unkempt hair and a wild look in his eyes. He looked like something out of a nightmare, someone who had been living off the land for far too long, and I could see the look of confusion and madness in his eyes. For a moment, he just stood there, staring at us, as if he couldn't figure out whether to run or fight. But then Adam made his move. He shouted one last time, his voice low and dangerous. "Get the hell out of here now." Adam raised his gun, and that was enough. The man turned and bolted into the darkness, vanishing into the desert night, as if he had never been there at all. We all sat there, frozen, too stunned to speak. It took a while for any of us to move, but eventually Adam slowly lowered his gun. I could feel the weight of the moment settle over us, like a thick, suffocating fog. We had been so sure that we were safe, that nothing could happen out here. But now, all I could think about was how easily that man had slipped into our camp without us noticing. Without saying a word, we all began packing up our things. There was no way we were staying another minute in that campsite. The last thing I wanted was to go back to sleep with the image of that man's wild eyes still burned into my mind. We didn't even bother with the coolers. We just threw everything into the back of the trucks and drove off into the night. We didn't speak much as we drove, the silence between us heavy and oppressive. Everyone was processing the same horrifying thought. What if Adam hadn't yelled? What if we hadn't woken up? Would that man have come into our tents? Would any of us still be here? We didn't go back to Arizona for a long time after that. And when we did, it was only because we were stupid enough to think that what happened was a one-time fluke. We decided to camp nearby, thinking that surely no one would be dumb enough to try the same thing again. I'll tell you this, I don't care what anyone says about the desert being peaceful. It's a place where people get lost, where they vanish, and where you have no idea who or what might be watching you when you think you're safe. So yeah, if you're ever thinking about camping near Tucson, Arizona, do yourself a favor and stay the hell away from the desert. The hills have eyes, and sometimes they're just waiting for you to fall asleep. Every year, when our birthday rolled around, my ex and I would drive down to Ginny Springs to celebrate. It was one of the only traditions we kept up even as the relationship started to fray at the edges. We had the same birthday, different years, same date, and for a while, it felt like the universe was giving us a hint that we were meant to be. We'd load up the car with our tent, coolers of food, plenty of water, and a little too much beer. I always brought my fishing rod, even though I never used it there. She packed her little solar lanterns and a deck of cards we'd rarely finish a game of. Every year, we'd pitch the tent near the same bend in the river, where the water moved slow and clear over the sandy bottom, and the trees hung low like they were eavesdropping on everything we said. That year felt different from the start. There wasn't any real fight leading up to the trip, but it was clear things between us had started to lose their shape. We were going through the motions, trying to hold on to something that used to come easy, But we still went, and I guess that meant something. The sun was already dipping low when we pulled into the familiar campsite. We set up in silence, only trading a few practical words about where the tent should go, who was grabbing firewood, how much ice we had left. By the time the fire was going, we were both nursing a drink, staring into the flames and pretending everything was fine. The air was thick with humidity, the kind that sticks to your skin and doesn't let go even after the sun's gone down. There's that deep Florida quiet, too. The kind where even the cicadas seem to hold their breath for a few seconds now and then. That's the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're being watched, even if you're not. We ate some cold sandwiches for dinner, listened to the sound of the river, and sat in our camping chairs like we were strangers who'd been dropped into the same place by mistake. Eventually, we climbed into the tent, zipped it up, and lay down on our sleeping bags without saying much. I remember it was hot as hell inside the tent. Even with the mesh top and the rain fly pulled halfway back, there was barely any breeze. We both tossed and turned for a while, trying to find a position where the sticky heat didn't feel so bad. I could hear the occasional splash of fish in the river and the distant laughter of some other campers, probably drinking and tubing all day, now winding down. But other than that, it was dead quiet, until the scream. It came out of nowhere and cut through the night like a knife. It wasn't human, at least I hoped it wasn't. It had this high-pitched, drawn-out wail that turned into something deeper halfway through, almost like a growl or a snarl. My heart jumped so hard it felt like it knocked the air out of my chest. I didn't even move at first. I just lay there frozen, listening, trying to make sense of what I just heard. Then it happened again, louder this time and closer, followed by a low, rumbling growl and some rustling, like something big moving through the brush. I could feel the ground vibrate slightly under my sleeping pad. My ex sat up slowly. I could hear her breath speeding up, short and shallow, like she was trying not to make any noise. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to breathe too loud. Every instinct I had was telling me to stay absolutely still. The scream came again, more guttural this time, and there was a crashing sound like something heavy knocking over branches or tumbling into the bushes. That's when I started thinking it had to be a mountain lion. Maybe two. I'd heard of them being in Florida, not super common, but they were out there. The way that noise came out, full of rage, wild and violent, it made my blood run cold. We were lying there inside a thin nylon tent, like a plastic bag between us, and whatever was making those sounds. I couldn't see anything. The fire had died down to just glowing coals, not enough light to see beyond a few feet. The moon was out, but the canopy of the trees blocked most of it. Everything outside the tent was shadows and movement. I wanted to grab my flashlight, but it was on the other side of the tent near her bag. I didn't want to reach across her. I didn't want to move too much and attract attention if something really was out there. Then there was this series of rapid, almost panicked grunts and a strange thumping sound. It was so close it sounded like it could have been right outside the tent. I felt the vibrations through the ground again, and that's when I finally sat up, slowly, trying not to make any noise as I moved. I didn't unzip the tent or do anything reckless. I just got on my knees, leaned forward, and looked up through the mesh part of the tent ceiling. At first, I didn't see anything. My eyes had to adjust to the darkness outside. Then I caught the outline of something moving. It was small, definitely not a mountain lion. It darted forward, then stopped, tail up and stiff. My mind was still racing, trying to make sense of what I was looking at when I saw the second shape. Lower to the ground, bulky, with an awkward kind of shuffle. I blinked hard. The first shape was a cat. A house cat. Just some stray, maybe someone's pet that had wandered out here and gotten lost or dumped. It was hissing and yowling like it had gone feral, for puffed up and arched so high it looked like a Halloween decoration. The second shape was an armadillo. Just a damn armadillo. I kept watching as the cat circled it, still growling and making these terrible noises that, I swear, had sounded 10 times bigger and more terrifying from inside the tent. The armadillo wasn't doing much, just holding its ground, backing up a little, then stepping forward again. They were caught in some kind of weird standoff, neither one willing to back down. The cat would hiss, the armadillo would scuffle a few inches to the side, then it would start all over again. I wanted to laugh, but the adrenaline was still wearing off. My heart was pounding so hard I felt like I could hear it in my ears. I sat there watching this ridiculous scene play out for a few more minutes until finally the cat gave up and stalked off into the trees, still making that awful sound like it was cursing at the world. The armadillo stayed frozen for a little while longer, then waddled away in the opposite direction. I slowly lay back down, heart still thumping. I didn't say anything. Neither did she. We both just stared at the ceiling of the tent, the dark mesh now silent and still. I don't think either of us slept much after that. In the morning, everything looked so normal. Birds were chirping, the river was calm and clear, and there was this warm, orange glow in the air like the forest had already forgotten the chaos of the night before. I stepped outside the tent, stretched, and checked the fire pit. Some ashes were still warm. I walked a little ways toward where the standoff had happened. There were paw prints in the sand and some scuffed up patches of dirt. Nothing dramatic, just signs of two animals crossing paths in the middle of the night, caught in their own little world of fear and instinct. That whole day felt strange, like something had shifted. We didn't talk much about what happened. We just went through the motions again, packed up, folded the tent, loaded the car. I remember looking back at the campsite one last time before we drove off. The fire pit, the trees, the path to the river. It all looked so peaceful. But I couldn't stop thinking about how quickly that peace had turned into something terrifying. It stuck with me that moment. Not because it was actually dangerous, but because of how real the fear felt. I never felt that kind of raw, stomach-dropping panic before. It reminded me how close we always are to losing the illusion of safety, how thin that line really is. One moment you're lying in a tent thinking about how sweaty you are, and the next you're sure you're about to get mauled by wild animals. After that trip, we never went back to Ginny Springs together. That birthday was the last one we shared. We drifted apart not long after. There wasn't one big fight or anything, just a slow, quiet unraveling. But sometimes I wonder if that night in the tent was a sign. Not from a universe or anything like that. Just a moment of clarity. A scream in the dark that turned out to be nothing, but still shook something loose inside me. And now, every time I hear a cat scream at night, or the scratchy shuffle of something moving through leaves, I remember that night. I remember the way fear makes everything sharper, how it grabs you by the spine and doesn't let go. And I remember how stupid I felt, lying there in my sleeping bag, certain I was about to die, when it was just a cat and an armadillo arguing over nothing.